All right. I'd like to call the Camarillo Board of Library Trustees meeting for July 27th to order, please. And would we have a roll call, please?
Trustee Craven?
I voted instead of turning on my mic here.
Trustee Mulchay?
Present.
Trustee Santangelo?
Here.
President Pro Tem Tremblay? Here. And President Kildee?
Here. Flag salute. Mr. Tremblay, would you lead us tonight, please?
Would you please follow me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, approval of the agenda. Do we need to vote on that, or can we just agree with as submitted? Is that good? Okay, we're going to get down to public comments for the library. Any public comments for the library tonight? All right, we're going to get down to consent calendar, which is A and B.
Move the approval.
Second.
It's a motion or second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Okay, that passes unanimously. All right, it's on discussion. We do have a great-looking community cookbook that was just submitted to me, and I can't wait to hear about it, so proceed, please.
Thank you. So good afternoon, Honorable Mayor, City Council, and staff. Thanks to your vote, we have seen remarkable changes this month, and it's been a joy to serve the community 7 days a week with evening hours Monday through Thursday. So with these changes, we are seeing positive results. We are more than halfway through our Read Beyond the Beaten Path summer reading program. So far we've had 993 kids, 123 teens, and 265 adults sign up with over 3,000 minutes read and counting. So last month in June, we honored Immigrant Heritage Month, and we asked community members to submit their families' recipes into our first Camarillo Library Community Cookbook, which you all have. So recipes range from Middle Eastern kebabs to Colombian empanadas. So you each have your own copy, but the condition is that you must make one of these recipes and bring it to library staff. So I hope that's a good promise. Looking forward to that. Also, I want to announce that the Camarillo Public Library has selected the Barbarian Nurseries by Hector Tabar for our Camarillo Reads event in 2022. Hector Tabar is a Los Angeles native, is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and novelist. His best-selling books include Deep Down Dark, The Last Great Road Bum, and The Tattooed Soldier. Tabar is also a contributing writer for the New York Times opinion pages and an associate professor at the University of California, Irvine. The author event will take place on Saturday, October 8th at 2 p.m. Copies of the book will be available at the library, both digitally and in print, in the next few weeks. Once we get our copies, I'll make sure that you each have one. And that concludes my report, and I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
All right, so are there any questions from anybody, comments or anything? I will make the enchiladas because those are my favorite.
There are 3 recipes.
And
which one?
before I deliver them, I'll make sure that at least half are there because I might want to dive into them on the way to the library.
Certainly, please.
All
We
kidding
can do a
aside,
picnic outside.
this is terrific. I think it's just a splendid idea, and I can't wait to try some of these recipes. So we're doing some new things and gaining headwinds, and I think that's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, no oral communication. So with that, we'll adjourn.
And I'm going to call order the meeting of the Camarillo City Council for today, July 27th. Let the record reflect that all council members are present. Do we have any amendments to this agenda? Seeing none, we're going to dive right into consent calendar.
Move the approval. Second.
I have a motion and a second. Please vote. And that passes unanimously. Before we get to oral communications, what we're going to do is we're going to recess so we can take some items under the Camarillo Sanitary District, and then we'll reconvene and do oral communications a little later. All right, so this time we'll we'll recess City Council.
I'll call the Camarillo Sanitary District Board meeting to order and ask the record to reflect that all board members are present. Is there any objection to the approval of the agenda? Okay, it's ordered approved. Public comments. This is the time the board hears from the public on items that are not on the agenda. Is there anyone who would like to speak to us on an item that's not on the agenda? Seeing no one come forward and I have no cards, we'll go on to the consent calendar.
I'll move the approval.
You could die for lack of a second.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Please vote. Motion carries, assuming Mr. Kildee voted yes. Okay, that gets us down to the discussion item, which is the wastewater master plan, long awaited.
Yes.
Could we have the staff report, please?
Of course. Thank you. Yeah, this item is to consider approving the wastewater master plan, which is the result of significant efforts to prepare a forward-looking planning tool that details the condition of the wastewater collection and treatment infrastructure and provides a roadmap to achieve the necessary long-term improvements. The wastewater master plan has identified that many components of the system are in poor condition and must be replaced within 10 years to maintain long-term resiliency and regulatory compliance. The master plan lays out the next steps towards improving the system, which includes several follow-up detailed studies that are necessary to further define the scope and sequence of the required improvements. Your approval of the consent calendar included one of those such studies that will be underway shortly. Implementation of the wastewater master plan will result in significant future costs requiring additional revenue that will need to come from increased sewer rates, possible bond proceeds, and potential grant funds for specific projects. In February of this year, the CSD board took a tour of the treatment plant to see the conditions firsthand, followed by a board meeting later in February where staff presented an overview of the master plan efforts. The draft wastewater master plan was then presented to the Utilities Committee on June 2nd of this year, and then updated to reflect comments and input received from the committee, with the final plan now provided to the board and presented for adoption. Now I'll turn it over to Josh Reynolds with WSC, who has been leading the master plan efforts and will present additional information.
Thank you, Dave. Mayor and members of the City Council, I'm Josh Reynolds at Water Systems Consulting, and I'm looking forward to presenting this master plan to you this evening and answering questions you may have. Let's see if this. So what I want to start with is just a bit of an overview here as to what a master plan is, maybe touch a little bit on what a master plan isn't, kind of lay out some of the methods and approach we took to this master plan up front, and then from there talk a little bit about the results of the collection system, and then the impacts at the wastewater treatment plant, the results of the analysis there, and then end with a little discussion of the next steps and the path forward for this facility. So what is a master plan? You know, really, it's a forward-looking planning document. And it's really looking at, in this case, the condition and the capacity of the critical infrastructure that forms your collection system. Some things it's not super O&M focused. It's not looking at operations and maintenance heavily. And it's not a design level evaluation. This is a high-level planning document that's looking at the condition and the next steps to keep the plant operational and in compliance. So this master plan is really just one step in the capital improvement process. So that's this first step here, this master plan, which is really looking at that long-term infrastructure, identifying the needs of the facilities. And from that, we feed into the 5-year CIP. So that's the ongoing annually adopted capital improvement program that the city adopts and implements over time. So the master plan is sort of foundational to that next step there, which is planning your capital improvement program. And then from there, or concurrent, you're going to have a rate study that's going to feed and support the implementation of that capital plan that's adopted by you. And you know, with that, you may have some rate adjustments or rate setting that's going into that. So the master plan is foundational to a lot of these activities, but it's not the end of these activities. There's going to be ongoing efforts to to plan their infrastructure improvements for the district. So I mentioned the two main, facilities we're looking at is the collection system and the wastewater reclamation plant. So the collection system, what do? We did flow projections, so we had to really quantify what kind of sewage are we dealing with now and in the future that need to be conveyed to the wastewater facility. We looked at that capacity of that collection system and then prepared a recommended list of projects with cost opinions. But what's next? Well, what's next is doing some flow projection verification by flow metering of the collection system, and then ongoing condition assessment by the city as part of the routine work that they do. And the water reclamation plant, what we did is we looked at, again, flows and loads or wastewater characterization, so we did a preliminary look at that. We reviewed the regulations that are likely to impact the facility over time, and then really looked heavily into the condition of the wastewater plant to really understand the driving need for upgrades at the facility. What's next here, there's a much longer list of what's next because there's a bigger need at the wastewater facility at the WERP. We do need to verify the flows and loads again by that same sampling and flow metering process that was approved by you. We want to model the plant 3. So we want to understand, hey, what's happening in the interim here with the plant? We want to look at the biosolids and really plan out the next steps there. And then really look at the preferred project and site. So right now we're making some high-level recommendations, and we'll get to that. But there's a lot of detail that's necessary to fill in for those final decisions to bring to you before you really start looking at what your future wastewater plant might look like. So just real quick here, high level, what is a wastewater system? You've got your customers that are connected to the collection system. So that's the series of gravity sewer pipes and pump stations that convey wastewater from a customer's location to the wastewater plant or the water reclamation plant, where it's treated to a very high level and then either discharged to Camarillo Creek, or most of it is used in the reclaimed water system here. That's generally, your wastewater system. And so we'll get into then start with the collection system here in a second. But I think one thing to kind of keep in mind as we're talking about it a bit, as we look at life cycle costs, this will come up pretty heavily with the collection system analysis, is really we're trying to sort of optimize replacement and rehabilitation of these assets. So, right, if we replace something too soon, you've lost the value of that asset. It's still good, it's still useful, it's still doing what it needs to do. So if you replace it too soon, you're losing the value of that that's already there in the ground. But if you replace it too late, you're paying a lot more to maintain it, to keep it up and working and operational. And if you're doing it in an emergency situation, if you're doing a replacement or repair in an emergency situation, that replacement is going to cost more. So what we want to do is sort of find that right time, not too soon and not too late, to replace those aging assets. So that's going to come up a bit when I say, hey, we're looking to optimize the replacement time. That's really what we mean, is not too soon, not too late. So the district's collection system, 144 miles of sewer main, 5 pump stations, with an average annual flow of about 3.6 million gallons per day. And that's the MGD that you'll see, so that's a million gallons per day. During wet weather, you have inflow and infiltration that raises that peak up to more like 10 million gallons per day. So how do we evaluate the collection system? Really the methodology we were following here was to evaluate the condition. And really that condition that we evaluated for the collection system was focused on an age-based analysis. So we looked at how old the pipelines are, we understand how they're going to degrade over time, I'll show a curve of that, and then we made some recommendations for replacement strategy. And then we looked at the capacity, so we built a hydraulic model of the entire wastewater collection system and evaluated the capacity of each pipe and the pump stations within the collection system based on the flow projections that we prepared. And from there, we identified projects to be upgraded, or pipelines that would need upgrade. So this is what I mean when I say the collection system condition, and this is a little bit, we'll back up a little bit and talk about these couple terms here. So we have pipe beyond end of useful life here. And so what that means is when we put an asset in the ground, or we design an asset, in this case, let's say a PVC sewer, gravity sewer pipe, we have an expectation that that pipeline is going to last a certain amount of time. It may last in this situation 60, 75, maybe 100 years. So that's how long you might expect that pipeline to last. And then once it gets beyond that, expected useful life, you are beyond the end of that useful life, and now you're assuming that it's time for replacement of that asset. So what we have is a curve here that's saying, hey, in 2020, very little of your pipe is beyond its expected useful life. But by 2030, you're going to have 40 miles of pipeline that's beyond its expected useful life. That doesn't mean, that pipe's going to fail immediately at the day that the clock ticks 100 years or 75 years. But it does mean that asset's going to require more upkeep, more maintenance than it did before. And that's going to continue going up over time, that it's going to need more input and effort to keep it up and running. So what we want to do again, right, is optimize that time, not too soon, but not too late. So what we can do is say, well, if I know that I need to replace all the pipe in 100 years, if I project it out, or 75 years, and I project that out, I might have a linear replacement program where I need to replace, in this case, I want to say like 2.2 miles of pipe every year. And as you can see by these two curves, if you do that, you're allowing, one, you need to start spending a lot of money immediately on that. You need to start spending money immediately on rehabilitation of the collection system. But it also means that you might allow your condition to degrade farther than you're comfortable with, so you need to play with that. But we can also look at it from a phased replacement standpoint, where we're doing fewer pipe initially. And I like this a little bit for you because you do have a CCTV program where you're inspecting the gravity pipes on a regular basis. You're programming those in your regular CIP for rehabilitation or slip lining and other upgrades. So overall, your condition of the collection system, you're staying on top of it. And now you're faced with, as we'll discuss, some major upgrades at the wastewater plant. So if we come in with a little more of a phased replacement, that allows you to focus your efforts on the wastewater plant, continue to monitor your gravity collection system to make sure that it's not getting in really bad condition, and then tackle it in the future once you've had that opportunity to really document the condition of the collection system. You've got the wastewater plant upgrades behind you, and now you can have a focused opportunity to really bring your collection system and renew it. So that's what that phase replacement strategy is showing. It's really quick on the collection system. So the recommendations here, and this is, I think, really important, continue those CCTV inspections. Continue monitoring and getting out there and monitoring the condition of your pipelines and track and trend those over time. And maintain a database. That's what I mean by that. So get those condition rankings, understand what they are, and then monitor how those pipelines are degrading or not degrading over time so that you can start trending out into the future when it needs to be up, when pipelines need rehabilitation effort. And continue on that annual pipeline rehabilitation. So that's in the CIP on a regular basis to do pipeline and manhole rehabilitation. Continue doing that. And then really, as you're approaching your rate setting and budget setting in the future, really budget for that long-term rehabilitation and be aware of that, the obligation that's out there. And finally, over time, increase the amount of pipeline being rehabilitated, commensurate with the observations through the CCTV inspection and the database and the trending of the condition of the collection system. And then we also did the capacity analysis, which, we project the flows, and we really built a hydraulic model using full GIS mapping of the entire collection system. We loaded that model and checked the system capacity. And from those flow projections, which I mentioned, we're at 3.6 MGD today. We're projecting about a 4.15, 4.2 MGD in the future at the 2040, which is, around build out. And we're seeing peak wet weather flow go from 10 to about 11.6 MGD in that same time frame. So we loaded those two. We looked at both scenarios, existing peak hour wet weather flow, and then we looked at the build out or the 2040 peak hour wet weather flow. And we used those two scenarios to look at impacts to the collection system. From there, we did identify some capacity improvements. That's the first column there. In the 1 to 5 year and the 6 to 10 year for capacity improvements. The next column is that infrastructural renewal, and that's where we talk about that curve of replacement for the collection system based on its anticipated useful life or expected useful life. And that's the total cost for the collection system. My understanding is generally most of this, a lot of that capacity improvement projects are in the 5-year CIP already, and generally the short-term infrastructure renewal strategy is also in the CIP. So it's just over time we need to monitor that and adjust it as the condition of the collection system changes. So that's the collection system. It's a little simpler than the outcomes at the water reclamation plant, which, it's a bigger hit there. So I think a little history on the water reclamation plant. It's been out there for more than 60 years, and it's overgone significant upgrades over that time. So the first plant, Plant 1, was constructed in 1957. It's yellow, it's a little hard to see, unfortunately, but it's up there in the right-hand corner. And then Plant 2 was built in 1962, and that added on to Plant 1, and I believe some changes to Plant 1 were also made to improve its treatment capacity. And then in 78, Plant 3 was brought online, and I can never remember if Plant 2 was abandoned in 78 or if it was abandoned in the 92 expansion. But 92, Plant 3 was upgraded again, added more capacity there, treatment capability, and the disinfection upgrades were built. And finally, in 2005, the level of treatment was improved, tertiary filtration was added, reclaimed water was brought online for the city. So that's the history of the plant, and it's a unique history, and that history creates some challenges for operations, but also provides some opportunities for upgrade. And we'll talk about that. So again, the methodology here for assessing the wastewater plant really was to look at the regulations, because regulations really are an important driver for the type of technology and the treatment that you need to provide to treat your wastewater. We looked at the condition of the plant, and so we did an assessment of the mechanical, structural, and electrical systems that form the wastewater plant. And then we did a little bit of a higher level look at treatment capability and capacity, where we looked at, is this plant operating now, and how will it be operating as we move forward? So we'll talk about the regulations. I think this is, a very important part of operating a wastewater plant. It's also, very complicated to understand, both what the current regulations are pretty straightforward, but really looking out into the future to predict regulations is really, really challenging, as you can imagine. So we had Larry Walker and Associates really help us with the regulatory considerations for the wastewater plant and the collection system. And so I'm just going to do, really a bit of a higher level kind of walk through some of the regulatory topics that we evaluated and looked at, and we can touch on how that impacts what we're looking at going forward. So the easiest one is really looking at the current effluent limit. You have a permit that dictates what you can do at the plant and what you can discharge, and so we're able to evaluate if the existing plant is able to meet consistently its current regulations. And then we looked at US EPA water quality and other efforts going on within the Los Angeles Basin Plan. And we combine that with some of the state board surface water quality objectives, because because you're discharging the Cayugas Creek, the surface water quality is going to be very important and drive what you're able to do at the plant. There's some other local issues that were evaluated, such as some of the TMDLs, the total maximum daily loads for Cayugas, and for Conejo and Lower Cayugas Creek, and then the MS4 permit, the municipal separate stormwater sewer system. So there's permits coming there that could impact the collection system, and then trying to predict a little bit where the salt and nutrient management plan is headed, and how that's going to impact your ability to discharge to the creek. We also looked at the recycled water standards and, looked at, does it make sense to move from the individual permit you have now for your recycled water system to the general permit? And there's some pros and cons there. And then we also looked a little bit out to see if state and federal drinking water standards, as they change and evolve, if they could have impacts on the wastewater plant. And then finally, we have the requirements for surface flow in the creek. And, if you're getting off the creek with your discharge, what impact might that have if surface flows are not being met downstream? So the general, the findings there, as we can all imagine, regulations are going to just continue to tighten over time. So whatever we're doing at the plant needs to be robust, it needs to be flexible, it needs to be some kind of reliable treatment technology. And what I mean by that is when we say it needs to be robust, it needs to be something that if regulations get tighter in the future, this is going to be a plant that you can modify or change how you're operating it in such a way that you can meet tighter regulatory requirements. It needs to be flexible similarly because we can't predict with great accuracy what the future regulations might be. So we want a flexible treatment train that is capable of meeting changing regulations. So we want to make sure that we're putting something out there that is going to last a long time and is going to be capable of being modified if necessary to changing regulations. So we made some general assumptions when we looked at the alternatives, just what type of discharge requirements might we have. They're moderate assumptions, so they could always be tighter than that. So we're trying to kind of walk a not overly conservative line there, but not make some assumptions that are unrealistic in the future either. But really, it's very important to continue monitoring the regulatory environment as this project develops and make sure that as things change and come up, that they're being incorporated into the project as it moves forward. So the condition assessment, there was a really, a big effort on evaluating the condition of the plant and the facility. To do that, we broke the plants into several process areas. That's plant 1, plant 2, which is abandoned generally, plant 3, the solids handling system, and then some of the common areas. And so what we did there when we did the condition assessment, it's a little hard to see, and I apologize for that, but what we did is we really focused on a remaining useful life assessment of these facilities. And so again, what that means is if we assume that a pump has a 25-year design life, a useful life, the remaining useful life, if it's been out there for 20 years, the remaining useful life would be 5 years. So it's just that subtraction of the estimated useful life minus time gives you your remaining useful life. However, we do a little bit of modification to that because we did a visual inspection and a review of issues at the plant. We adjusted that age up and down based on the condition of that asset. So if you're looking at a sludge pump out there, for instance, and they can't get parts for it anymore and it's falling apart, well, even if it's allegedly still has 5 years left, if we can visually see, no, it doesn't, then we would rate it as not having any remaining useful life. And conversely, if we look at it and go, it's supposed to have 5 years left, but it hasn't been used a lot, it's been maintained really well, et cetera, then we're going to give it a little more useful life as we work through it. So that's generally what we did. And then we also evaluated, we didn't just do condition ranking, but we also looked at some other criteria here, and that was the operator's perception of safety, the long-term resiliency, what's the risk of failure? So is this a really critical asset that if it fails causes other follow-on problems? How is it performing technically? Is it doing what it's supposed to or is it not doing what it's supposed to? And then what's how is it to operate and maintain, and what's the opinion of how it is to keep that thing working? So this is just the general summary of those major assets that we looked at. And as you can see, if you look down on the left side here, some of the common areas have 5 to 15 years of life remaining. I think it's important to point out the solids really have that 3 to 10 years of life remaining. That's really on the shorter end of things. And then most of the other assets are in that 10 to 20 years or more of remaining useful life. It should be noted here that when we, this is the summary, but we did look at, the breakdown of this in the master plan report itself really goes into a lot more detail on individual assets. And as we reviewed those, assets that are rated a 5 or very poor through that process, have been highlighted, and the staff are reviewing those for need for intermediate upgrade. Some of them are already initiated, but they are aware of those need to keep those operational, and so they've been flagged and they're on their radar to investigate and move forward. So, the bottom line is that the warp it's old. It's been out there a long time. It's done what it needed to do for a long time, but it's reaching the end of its useful life. Some of those assets, especially the solids handling side of things, the digesters, really require replacement within the next 10 years. And it's very important that we put that to the front because that's really, as we look at the timeline, that's really one of the big drivers for some of the next steps. So we did an alternatives analysis for both the liquid stream and the solid stream. So from here, I'm going to kind of split them into two. We're going to talk liquid stream, we're going to talk solid stream. But we'll start with solid stream because it is really on the more critical path relative to the liquid stream. So one of the important keys to the handling of biosolids out there is what classification of biosolids do we have? And that's really very simply a Class A and a Class B biosolids. And the type of biosolids really dictates what you can do with that biosolid. So the Class A biosolid is the higher level of treatment. It's considered pathogen-free. And because of that pathogen-free status, you're able to apply it to land and otherwise use it with much fewer restrictions than you could a Class B. So the Class B biosolids, which are treated less, they're considered to be reduced pathogens, so they do have treatment in them. But it's not enough that you can have open use of that biosolid product. It has to either undergo further treatment before it can be reused, or it has to be used in a way that there's restrictions on where and what type of access folks have to it. So that's a major consideration as we look at some of these alternatives to your biosolids system at the wastewater plant. Is do we need Class A, or is Class B going to be okay? I think one more thing on that, the Class B designation. There is some legislation recently around reduction of organics to landfills, and that reduction of organics to landfills is likely to put pressure on the Class B and maybe even the Class A disposal avenues that are traditionally available to agencies. So we haven't really seen how that's going to play out yet. That's just going into effect. But what we expect is that it's going to put a lot of pressure on the more traditional disposal methods, and they're going to get either more expensive or harder to get contracts to do that. So if we look at some of these Class B solid stream alternatives that are on the table for the WERP, we'll walk through this here and just kind of walk you through what that is. So thickening, if we think about the wastewater process, you bring the liquid streams in, it gets treated biologically in tanks out there, and then gets clarified. And through that process, you're growing bugs and other bacteria to treat the water, and that's creating a sludge that is then pulled off and is sent into the solids stream handling system. So the first step here that we're envisioning in the future is thickening. And so there's a few technologies available for thickening. We kind of lay out all those technologies, the pros and cons of them in the report. And then from there, it would go to anaerobic digestion, which you currently do anaerobic digestion at your facility, and that asset is doing some major rehabilitation right now and is really a big driver of this 10-year timeline for upgrades for the solids handling system. From the digestion, it goes into a dewatering. So BFP is a belt filter press. That's what you have out there now for dewatering. And so we would envision a very similar either use of that same belt filter press or some technology that's going to do dewatering for you. And from there, that creates what we would call a Class B cake. And we have listed on the right-hand side some of the end uses available for a Class B cake. Landfill or alternative daily cover, well, that's one that's going to get tighter and may be going away because of regulations. And then we have bulk agriculture where it can be used or composted or other treatment so that it can be used for disposal in agricultural systems. So that's a Class B solid stream alternative. And then if we look at the map here, here we have the existing digesters, and we have some ponds that are used as part of the solids handling system here and here, and your belt filter press is right there. And so what we would see in the future is potential, and I guess keep in mind that this is a preliminary look at where facilities might go, right? This isn't set in concrete. It's, hey, do we have room out there to fit the facilities at the plant? And so if we keep that in mind, we would say, all right, we could put the digesters up here where plant 2 is, and then do a new solids handling building down here where you would have your thickening and your dewatering facilities in this building. So that's a Class B solid stream alternative. In Class A solid stream alternative, there's 2 main options, composting or solar drying. The big difference here, well, twofold, is composting takes a bit more area, as you'll see in the map, and it has some different end uses that are available. So one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these Class A biosolids, whether it be composting or solar drying, we haven't really studied yet, or we need to study the market for Class A products. So if you're creating a Class A product out there, you need to know that you have the ability to sell it, to get rid of it, to land apply it, or do something with it. So a market study of that would look at what are the potential uses for Class A biosolids in the region, and then that would inform this decision on whether composting or solar drying or Class B is the better alternative for you. So for the Class A, we're still doing the same thickening, stabilizing, and dewatering system as a Class B, but we're adding another step here, composting. And then composting we can use for, agriculture, land application. You can use it and sell it locally as a product, as a compost product. If we look at where composting would be, again, we still have the same digesters up here. We have the same dewatering building here, but then we would add a composting complex over here on top of some of these old sludge drying beds that wouldn't be used anymore. So it's a big area. It takes some area to do composting. But at the end, it gives you a Class A product that has some value and ability to dispose of it. The other alternative is solar drying. Again, it has a few different uses, but very similar. And so the soil drying is really like a big greenhouse that gets hot in there, and then with fans and mixing, you're going to dry that biosolid product out a lot more and get it hotter than you would just laying it out on some concrete. So that creates that Class A. Again, it has some better uses. A little smaller footprint. This was the composting area here. Solar drying takes a little bit of a smaller area. It's a little more expensive from capital improvement, from a capital expense side of things, but a little cheaper for long-term operations. So that's the biosolids recommended improvements. The next steps here, so this is what was just approved here, was that flow and load study. And in that, we have the market study. So let's understand, where can we use Class A and Class B biosolids in the region? What's the market for it? So the liquid stream, now the liquid stream alternative analysis is a little different than what we did with the biosolids. The liquid stream alternatives, we have really 4 alternatives that we're looking at. Alternative 1, which is expand and rehabilitate plant 3. So that's sort of the status quo, if you will. Alternative 2 was, all right, let's do what we need to do on plant 3, but if plant 3 can't meet future regulatory requirements, we may need to add another step of additional treatment onto it in order to meet the regulations. Alternative 3 is, let's build a new treatment plant at the existing facility. So, and note there that, as we were looking at this, really that includes the adjacent parcel next door. So it's the 50-acre parcel next door or within the existing fence line, but building a new facility at the existing wastewater plant location. And plant 4 would be, hey, what if there are challenges to building a new wastewater plant at the existing site? What would it take if we built a new treatment plant somewhere else? For instance, at Pump Station 3. Just somewhere nowhere near the existing wastewater plant. So what we did is we looked at these alternatives using both economic and non-economic criteria. So the economic criteria are pretty straightforward: construction cost, operation cost, right? What's that life cycle cost for that asset, for that alternative? And the non-economic criteria is, a little more challenging in the sense, how do you rate some of these things? So what we did is we created a list with staff of, we have 6 of the economic criteria here: performance, resiliency, O&M, environmental and community impacts. How is it going to integrate with the existing facility, and how implementable is it? And then what we did is, this is not here, we did what we called a pairwise comparison. So we said, all right, for alternative 1 and alternative 2, which is better at technical performance? All right, well, alternative 2 is, because in this case it's got additional treatment capability, so it's going to perform better. And so we went through every one of the alternatives, compared alternative 1 to 2, 3, 4, and then 2, 3, and we worked through each of these and just ranked which one is better at each of these criteria. And through that, we came up with this non-economic score that you see on the bottom here. And to the right is higher is better, so that means it performed better in the non-economic analysis. To the left is worse. And so as you can see, alternative 1 performed the worst on the non-economic criteria, alternative 3 performed the best on the non-economic criteria. And then when we brought in cost to that, so the size of the circles represent the capital cost. So in this case, for alternative 3, we're projecting $95 million in capital cost. Alternative 4, $143 million. And so we rank them like this, and then up here is the net present value. So that's the overall life cycle. So when we add in operations cost and other upkeep over the life of the asset, you get some of this net present value over here, and lower would be better, and for net present value, a smaller circle would be better. So here we see alternative 3 really gapping the other alternatives based on the non-economic criteria. It is a little more expensive than alternative 2. It's less expensive than alternative 4, and the life cycle cost is a little more expensive than alternative 2. So through that analysis, we're recommending alternative 3 as a preferred project to move forward with. So, it has some advantages here in the sense that it's using the existing footprint at the WERP. Because you're building an all-new facility, it simplifies construction sequencing. So we can build that plant out there while you're keeping your existing plant in operation. And because it's a new treatment type, you can really optimize its performance and its design to meet your anticipated regulatory requirements. So, alternative 1 and 2 are really limited by what plant 3's capabilities are, whereas a new plant in alternative 3 would be designed from the ground up to meet regulatory requirements. So some of the disadvantages, it's a new technology. So, we have to make sure that it's something that's proven. We don't want to be on the bleeding edge. We want to make sure that we're using proven technology. Operations understands how to operate it, and we know how to move forward with it. And that, and I don't know that this is a really bad thing, but we will be abandoning assets. So if you're stranding cost out there, if you're stranding remaining useful life, that is a cost that's lost. So there is some disadvantage there with building entirely new and then scrapping all of the existing infrastructure. So the cost of that, if we look down here for the WERP, the solid stream improvements, $24 million. The liquid stream improvements, $106 million. There's some additional biosolids management, and that's the Class A. So this cost appears for Class B, and this cost down here is to get you to a Class A. And these are programmed currently in the 5-year CIP as Phase 1, which is the biosolids, the solid stream upgrades, to get to Class B, and these 2 steps are in there as the Phase 2 for the wastewater treatment plant upgrades. So let's talk a little about phasing and timeline, how we want to get this done. So the technical studies, that was that wastewater characterization, flows and load study that was approved this evening. CEQA and permitting needs to get kicked off, and it's going to take some time to stay on top of that. We'd like to start biosolids facility plan and the WERP facility planning this year to get that moving, so that if we look at the critical need here is to get that biosolids up and ready around 2025. That's a pretty short timeline. I'm sorry, the construction, my bad. Finish the design in 2025, finish the construction, in 2026, 2027. So about 5 to 6 years from now to finish up biosolids construction. The facility plan for the WERP is important to go concurrent with the biosolids because, as you can imagine, we want to plan out the site to make sure that we're not putting biosolids facilities where you want your wastewater facilities in the future. And we need to make a decision on, the final site and the technology to be used so that we can really make sure that the biosolids facilities are being sized appropriately. And then from there's a bit of a gap before you initiate WERP design and upgrades and construction at the wastewater plant, which takes you out past 2032. So some of those next steps, the flows and load study, which is really looking at getting some sewer flow monitoring, gathering some data on the facility, doing some sampling. Really important, I think, is that interim operations planning. So we want to do a stress test of Plant 3, understand what its real capacity is, and how it can be operated in the interim before the new plant is brought online, and really understand what essential plant upgrades are necessary to keep this plant operational out into 2030s. And then the biosolids facility plan will look at that market study we talked about, some process optimization for your biosolids, really detail out the alternatives, make sure that this high-level look that we did now carries forward with more detail. And then, that leads into construction, design and construction of the biosolids improvements, and the warp upgrade facility plan would really dig into the alternatives, right? Right now, we're just saying, hey, let's build a new plant, but we aren't detailing what type of technology we would use for that new plant. It could be a membrane bioreactor, it could be some other form of treatment. So we need to really dig in and pick the right treatment, understand the right technology, site it on the site, understand how it impacts the parcel to the west, and really detail out what the future facility looks like. And then from there, it would move into design and construction of the warp improvements. That's my really high-level, I think, presentation of I don't know if it's a very large document. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions here, and I'm happy to answer what I can and dig into this.
Any questions? Kevin?
To go first? Okay. Yeah, well, thanks for the report. I know I found it really fascinating going through that, and I learned an awful lot, and I'm far from being any kind of an expert on much of anything about this, but it looks to me like the biosolids are probably, really something that we need to look at, if not the earliest, very early in this game. And with that, and you kind of talked about the technology with that, how are we going to try to kind of decide which is the best technology to go with? I mean, we're hoping to get, I believe, is it fair to say we might be able to get anywhere from 25 to 35 years out of this if we, if we're going to do alternative 3 like you're suggesting? And within that, does that allow us an opportunity to upgrade the technology within those years or not? Or is pretty much what you're going to decide to do is pretty much what you have there? I know it's a little bit of a loaded question, but if you could at least start to attempt to kind of talk a little bit about that first.
Yeah, I think that first, in terms of design life, some of the assets are going to have a shorter life than others. But if you think about your existing wastewater plant, it's been up and operating for a long time. So I'd expect when you're putting new concrete in the ground, it's going to have a 50-plus year lifespan. So some of those assets are going to be out there for a long time. But if we're doing, say, a membrane bioreactor, some of those assets are going to get replaced on a 10-year or a 10-year program. Some of the membranes might need to be replaced more frequently. Pumps might be replaced at the 25 years. So there's going to be ongoing upgrade of whatever goes out there. So some of it's going to need to be replaced earlier, and some's going to be out there for a long time. I mean, the concrete that's out there now some of it's not in great condition, but a lot of it is still in okay condition. It's just that the treatment technology isn't really set up to meet really the tighter regulatory requirements that we're seeing now.
And can you talk a little bit about the cost of this and how the model will interpret what the costs are going to be? I would see that would be really challenging to really know exactly, because we're talking about anywhere from 5 to 7 years here. And can you talk a little bit how you're going to model that costing on that?
Yeah, I mean, the current costs were, they're pretty high level. So they're not, if you think about they're not super accurate, right? Because we don't know exactly how big a facility is. I can't calculate the amount of concrete that's going to go into it. So we can't get into that level of detail. But what we can do is look at what, in our experience, these assets, what other places are paying to build a similar size facility, and then we've scaled them up. Now, some of these costs were done before the most recent inflation kicked in. So, if that tails off, which hopefully it does, we'd be better off than if it's going to continue on. So there are some assumptions about inflation, and we're pushing the cost out to midpoint of construction. I want to say we're probably assuming more like a 3% inflation, not a 7 or 8% inflation. So that will impact it. As we bring more detail, in the next step, we're going to bring a lot more detail to what's going out there, where it's going to be, what has to be abandoned. That allows that opportunity to really advance those cost opinions and push them to more detail. So we have some conservatism built into it. We have, I think, I want to say like I'll get confused. We have a pretty high contingency that we're carrying in those cost opinions. And so over time, as you start tightening down the cost opinions, you can start decreasing the contingency that you're carrying, which hopefully puts you in a position where you land in around the budget area.
Can you, and my last question for a real quick comment, can you shed a little bit of light on what you can try to prognosticate as far as the regulatory issues may be? Because as we, go through this, I wouldn't like to see a regulation come that, kind of out of left field, if you will, and especially now in this very intricate time that we're trying to not only forecast this and model this, but also try to pay for it as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point of trying to really, writing that regulatory chapter too, which was really looking at the regulations, and Appendix A, which is really deep dive into where we think regulations are heading. And so there's a lot of unknowns there. And so, what we don't want to be is if we assume now, hey, we're going to see a total nitrogen of 0.1, really, really low, right? Instead of 10, which would be more expected. But if we see a really low total nitrogen, we're not assuming that right now, because if we assume that right now you have a $200 million project instead of a $135 million project. So I don't think that that's a reasonable number that we're going to see in the future, but there is talk about it. So it's really, right now we're trying to sort of straddle that line of something that's a little bit conservative, but not really overly conservative. But that's going to have to really be monitored as we're moving forward and understand where regional board is heading, where state board is heading on some of these regulations, and we're going to need to be adjusting as we go forward with the plant design. So right now, we're talking about a state-of-the-art facility as an alternative 3. It's something that would be as good or better than the majority of agencies in the state of California. So if regulations are coming forward that are going to make it so that that plant can't meet the needs, that has a major impact statewide too. Because if your plant, which is a new facility, is going to have trouble meeting it, then older plants are going to have really a lot of trouble meeting it as well.
I appreciate the thoroughness. I know this is a, very technical manual and a lot of work. I know it took a lot of time to, develop this, but I can see why now. And I know this is just the first of many of a process that's going to take some time, but this is a good first step. So I appreciate it.
Susan?
Sure, I'll go next. So for all of you at home, this is what we've had, and it's really technical.
2 of them.
You're right, I forgot the appendices. It's really, really technical. And so, a lot of this is, for me, trusting in your expertise. And so, first of all, I kind of want to understand exactly what we're deciding right now, right? And it looks like right now, we're deciding, at least for the liquid stream, on alternative 3. That's correct, right?
That's the recommendation right now, yeah.
It looks like for the solid stream, we're not really making a decision yet because we have to do that further analysis. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about, could you talk about a little bit more about, I don't think people at home, and I certainly didn't before, knew that we actually could do something productive with the, end result. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit more about what those options are and what Class A versus Class B? Does my question make sense to you?
Yeah. And I think one thing to keep in mind is at your facility, you're creating a Class B biosolid that's then hauled to a composter. And I understand they're at least making some of that into a Class A through the composting process, and then it's being used in some kind of land application. I don't have a great handle on the provenance of your sludge when it leaves here and arrives there and then gets further treated and then goes somewhere else. But it is being used. And so you're already in a situation where you're ahead of the game in some ways because you're not taking your sludge, your treated, your Class B from your plant and putting it in a landfill as alternative daily cover. That's going away or gone, depending on the time frame. So you're lucky in that sense, or prescient in the sense that it's already going somewhere and being composted to a Class A biosolids. The concern here is that if we see a lot of pressure coming on those composters because this agency that used to just put it in their landfill now has to send it somewhere, and they show up with a pile of money and say, no, take ours first, that drives up the cost of managing letting someone else manage your biosolids, and create a compost. That's really the big risk and what's happening here. Because when I first read the regs, I went, what's this got to do with wastewater plants, right? And then you kind of start digging into it and you start talking to folks that really understand the biosolids, and they're like, it's not you that's the problem, it's everybody that just lost their ability to landfill their Class B cake. So some of the uses, I'm not a super great expert on this, but I think one of the big ones is composting. We're surrounded by ag. Class A compost can be used widely within agriculture. So that's, I think, really the use and probably the most likely use, but that's where the market study really needs to sort of dig in and see, do people want it? Would people use it? Can you find an application for it? And I understand the compost a little more so than the solar drying, but the solar drying creates a fertilizer type product that can be used also in an agricultural or horticultural environment. So whether it's being sold or simply disposed of is not super clear to me, and I think really requires understanding what the market is in this area. That's why that's really one of the top next decisions is let's evaluate and understand the market for Class A and B biosolids in the region and have that available as we're looking at decisions coming up before Class A or a Class B project at the wastewater plant.
And then for the liquid stream, could you, I know it's in great detail here, but could you explain again why alternative 3 is the one that's being recommended?
Primarily because of its non-economic ranking criteria, in the sense that it ranked the highest as the ability to meet long-term regulatory requirements. So when we talk about this project a lot right now, and a lot of the risk and the unknowns here are, what do regulations look like 25 years from now? What do discharge regulations look like? And that's really the biggest risk to a successful project here. If we pull that out of the situation, it's really easy to treat wastewater to the current standards or the known standards and discharge it or use it in a recycled water system. But what we don't know is what's going to happen 10, 25 years from now. We can try our best to kind of keep our finger on the pulse, but we don't really know what it's going to look like. So when we look and we did this non-economic criteria ranking, alternative 3 ranks the highest in its ability to be resilient and flexible to future regulatory changes. And with that additional flexibility comes a bit of an extra price tag. But it's not orders of magnitude more price relative to some of the alternatives that don't allow you that long-term ability to meet some of the regulations. So if we went out there and just did some work on Plant 3 as it sits now, did some minor upgrades to it, they still are pretty expensive, but when you're done with it, you're in a situation where it's going to be much harder to respond to tightening regulations, just because that treatment technology is not flexible enough to be ready for tightening regulations. So that was really the big thing for alternative 3 was looking at that non-economic criteria. When we compare that to the other alternatives, it just is a much better product for the city and for long-term operations. So having said that, it's not a foregone conclusion as to what alternative 3 looks like, right? That's what these next step studies really need to dig into, and they really need to take a little more of a sensitivity analysis. Say, all right, you assumed this level of treatment. What happens if it needs to be higher? What happens if it's lower? How sensitive is your design and your cost to those changes? And look at that alternative to make sure it's still the right one and we're using the right technology as we move forward.
Thank you.
Sean?
I don't have a lot of specific questions because Utilities Committee have already kind of gone, I went through the draft version of this. So my wife reads Harry Potter and I guess I get to read this. That's how it works in our household.
Well, it's very useful.
Mr. Kildee touched on some of the questions I was going to ask around cost. It's always one of my concerns. You kind of already answered those questions. The changes we've seen in some of these costs relative to the inflation we're seeing, that doesn't necessarily change dynamically any of your suggestions here. Everything's kind of moving in line
Right.
relative to one another.
Right.
It's just now the numbers are going to be a little bit bigger.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're comparatively, they're going to move with each other
Right.
generally.
Right. Aside from that, there was one thing I saw on planned improvement projects at 7.2.1. We talked about the reclaimed water pump and the $1 million gallon storage reservoir for reclaimed water. And it said on there that we were aiming to complete design in fiscal year 21, 22, and also complete construction, initiate construction in fiscal year 21, 22, but we haven't begun that yet.
That's right.
You know, so I know we're a
We're
little behind
there, yeah.
on there. I just want, okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask where we are with that? I know it's a little bit out of scope here, but I was curious as to where.
We're doing the design on that. So we've turned in the 60% and received 60% comments from the city, but there are some concerns around the flooding and flood wall, flood improvements at the WRP and at the, what that's going to look like. So we want to make sure we're coordinating improvements with the reclaimed water storage system with the potential for flood improvements at the site. So I wouldn't say we're pausing, but we're slowing our step a little as we move towards 90%, just to double check that and make sure that we're not going to be doing something that either is in the wrong place or is too low to manage, flooding at the site.
And just, that gets me into my next question or comment is how, we have some timelines, some general timelines in here. How confident are we that we're going to be able to hit those, or they look rather ambitious for the size and scope of those projects?
Yeah, I think that the WRP upgrade, I know it's 10 some odd years. That is a tight timeline, though. You look out and you go, we got start construction 8 years from now, 7 years from now. That's a long time. And you're absolutely right. That's not a lot of time. It feels like it, but it does require a really focused effort now. And that's why it was important to get this first next steps off the ground so that we can start gathering that data over time, because we only have this winter coming up. We want to get flow information this winter. So it's important to start on that now. I think it's very doable. I think your staff feels that it's doable and we can achieve this. We've had a little bit of good news, I think, on the digester rehabilitation project, where it's looking like it's maybe a year, it's got a little more life in it than we thought. So I think that needs to kind of come back as we're doing the next step too, is pull in the results of that and look at that timeline. But I think it's good to get started now and start sprinting, if you will, for the finish line. And then adjust that timeline as more information becomes available. I think it's achievable, but it's going to require very focused effort to make it happen.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, Tony.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Probably won't surprise you that I've got a lot of questions for
Really?
you, Josh.
We don't
And
ever guess.
I really appreciate all of your efforts on this, and so the public knows, the mayor and I have already gone through a 2-hour Utilities Committee meeting where we asked many questions, and we really appreciate yours and staff's responses. I think many of the questions I want to ask came up during that June 2 meeting, but I think they are important issues because their answer, in my view, is going to inform our decision-making as a council in the future, particularly if we're doing this in a phased or incremental fashion. And some of these questions are more contextual in nature. They're more macro, and some are more micro. Like Susan did, I'm going to hold up this binder. I read the appendix too, but I'm not going to go through the appendix. But this is the main binder, and I'm going to refer to the pages as I go through, so you just have to stroll through. First thing, Josh, and a couple of these are going to probably be for Dave and not for you. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll put Dave on the spot. First of all, the council went to the water reclamation plant back in February, on February 1st, and you made a presentation to us at that point. Were there any material differences in the documentation given to us at that point versus what has been presented in this draft plan?
No, it's generally the same content. I think some of the timeline has shifted around a little bit, and maybe some of the next steps have been detailed out a little bit more as we listened to your questions that you had at that time. But generally, no, it's the same alternative 3 and similar costs.
Okay. And if I'm understanding this correctly, the recommendation of WSC is that we do the liquid stream improvements second, behind the solid stream improvements, on the basis that the solid streams improvement, and I think you said it earlier tonight, is on a more quote-unquote critical path schedule than the liquids improvements. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's right, yeah.
But on the other hand, what you are also suggesting is that the planning for both the solids on the one hand and the liquids on the other hand run concurrently, correct?
They need to inform each other, yeah.
They do need, right, and that's what I'm getting at. They do need to inform one another because they're highly related. And that would also apply to any CEQA review that the CSD would have to do, correct?
Right, right.
Okay. On page ES-7, Executive Summary 7, there is a discussion on the WRP Upgrades Facility Plan. In the initial draft, it was shown as taking until winter 2025. It has now been changed to say summer 2022 to winter 2023. Can you explain why that change has been made?
That was really to much more align the need to feed information into the biosolids facility planning process. So we wanted to, I believe that was actually your insight, but we wanted to really pull forward that facility planning earlier, do it concurrent with the biosolids facility planning so that we could, feed information in. We can do it without, but it's a better product if we do them together.
Okay, all right, that's where I figured you were going to go. On the, and this is more of a Dave question, so take a break for a second. On the capital project cost summary on table page ES3 on table ES2, there is a, well, that's got the collection system project cost summary, but there's also a capital project cost summary. Anyway, looking ahead in a more macro sense, Dave, have city staff given any thought to how the city is going to finance these improvements? Because at a minimum, under your recommendation, we're at $135 million. Some of that money comes out of CSD reserves. Some is going to come through an incurred indebtedness in whatever form that may be relative to bonds or something else. But have you started to give any thought to what that might look like? And maybe that's a Greg question too, and a city manager question.
Right, and yes, we have, and the main form that takes is in our annual review of the enterprise fund as a whole, revenues and expenses, and then a major element of that is looking at both the O&M costs and then planned capital costs, and how that affects the outlook for expenses in the years to come, and analyzing what adjustments may be needed on the rates, but also incorporating as the best estimate as possible on what would likely, because of these large capital needs, likely be revenue coming from bond proceeds. And in addition, we're definitely going to, we already are and will continue to look for grant opportunities for capital improvement. So it's going to be a mix that right now is at a very conceptual level, and this is one of the key steps that we wanted to finish is approval of the master plan here with these numbers and this alternative selected, and then the approach then in our next round of analysis of the enterprise fund and the rates. We would be basing it on this information here that's now approved, and then will be continually refined as the years go on as we progress through the implementation of this. So it's going to be an iterative process with additional information known as we move along to better refine the costs and the impacts then that has on the entire enterprise fund and subsequently rates and other funding mechanisms that we'll need to look at.
Okay, well, putting aside a review of the enterprise fund, and putting aside relative to rates, let me reframe the question. It appears to me that a significant portion of these capital costs, the city is going to need to raise the money to finance these improvements through a very large debt incurred. It's going to need to incur a large amount of debt.
Right.
The question I have is the conceptual thought to date that the city is going to borrow a large sum of money and utilize it in almost like a construction drawdown, or is it going to be incremental if these improvements are phased?
Right.
In other words, multiple bond issuances.
Right. I think we haven't come to a final answer on that. You know, we know the need to analyze that and want to take that next step to do that upon adoption of the plan, master plan, and then that'll be the next, in the next coming year, that further steps to further analyze which way to do that is best.
Okay. Well, it's of concern to me personally that we see that analysis sooner rather than later, because I've got some concerns on the alternatives analysis on alternative 3 versus alternative 2, and I'll get to those in a few minutes. But alternative 2 is significantly less than alternative 3, but I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So from a regulatory consideration standpoint, and now I'm talking about Chapter 2, page 2-2, there are constituents that keep wastewater engineers up at night or make them wake up at 3 a.m. What constituents for you are most problematic from a treatment train standpoint, treatment process standpoint, and then a cost compliance standpoint, when you think about our plan?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually relatively easy because it's salts. So
Okay.
TDS and/or chloride, sulfate, some of those dissolved solids that are in the wastewater stream that aren't treated through the biological treatment process.
Okay, and then Mr. Kildee, I think, got to this earlier with respect to regulatory considerations and looking at future constituents. But in terms of future regulatory, I know it's hard to take out your crystal ball, Josh, but what out of those listings, right around pages 2.5 and 2.6, what cause you the most? Is it the PFAS, or are they other constituents, or are they, for example, the persistent or accumulative metals, copper, selenium, et cetera, that are the most potentially problematic?
Yeah, it's anything that might trigger the need for something like a reverse osmosis addition to the treatment train out there. So with the desalter coming online, that's going to work to drive down the TDS of the influent to the wastewater plant. So I'm anxious to see what impact that has over time at the wastewater plant, because that'll make a big difference to what's coming in. If it's coming down in salts because of the desalter project, that's going to help meet better effluent coming out on the other end. So for me, it's that salts, metals, anything that can't come out through biological processing.
Well, in fact, doesn't page 2-6 indicate that the final SNMP for the Pleasant Valley groundwater basin is going to influence management actions for recycled water use and their impact to the basin water quality?
Yeah, and nutrients may come out of that, right? So it may require a tightening of some of the nutrient loading, but if that happens, biological treatment is set up to manage that. So especially a future plant upgrade. But if it also comes along with targeted reduction in salts, then that really ends up becoming the bigger driver, and the biggest cost risk really is if salt reduction is required.
Okay. Can I keep going? Okay. So on page, now to go to Chapter 5 on some of the condition rating of some of the components, and specifically on page 5-6 under Table 5.3. For example, you have the primary influent pump station, which has an overall rating. When you have a rating of 4, it's a poor condition. When it's a 5, it's a very poor condition.
Right.
And I know, for example, I got really concerned when I looked at the electrical building number 1 and the headworks panels, which had a condition rating of 5 on the original draft plan. But then in this new plan, it basically said, no, it's going to get a 1 now because the mechanical bar screen panel was replaced.
That's right.
Okay, so that leads me to this question, and that is this. just generically, shouldn't an asset with a condition rating of a 5 or a 4, shouldn't it be prioritized for improvement? Now, this is on the liquid stream side. Should it not be prioritized for improvement ahead of the solid stream improvements? Because remember, we talked a few minutes ago about which was going to go first. But if you have a very poor condition with a low remaining useful life, wouldn't you want to prioritize those and put those in and maybe that's what you meant by an intermediate upgrade basis? Is that what you meant?
That's exactly what we meant. So there are going to
Okay.
be, we will need to do, right? I mean, we can't just stop spending money to continue to operate and maintain the existing plant because we plan a major upgrade. Gives this opportunity to create a detailed list of assets at the facility that confirm what the operations staff already know needs to happen. And now we've got it in writing here and we're documenting what it looks like. And that helps them prioritize their efforts. And that's why you're seeing some of like that panel that was a 5 before in the draft. Well, they just upgraded it. So we went ahead and updated this when we did the next revision to show that that panel was replaced. So we're trying to make it a bit of a living document, but it's, always going to be a little behind the actual conditions that are out there. But yes, you're right. Those category 5 especially really need to be looked on an individual case-by-case basis and prioritized for some kind of an intervention, whether it be full replacement or some kind of an upgrade to rehabilitate it.
Right, because otherwise we're going to run into a safety issue or a regulatory compliance issue,
right.
right?
And that's why the Plant 3 stress test is really important, because that may identify how much of Plant 1 do we need to keep putting, money into, or can we operate on Plant 3? Or what does that look like? Can you reduce the flow going to Plant 1? Is there some kind of hybrid we can take here in order to, manage, bleeding to death from 1,000 cuts, right? And so we want to make sure that we're looking at those interim upgrades in a responsible manner to make sure you're discharging and meeting your regulatory requirements.
Okay. On the liquid stream alternatives analysis, let's turn to that for a few minutes. In section 8.1.5, which is on page 8-9, and the Utilities Committee looked at this at some length at our prior meeting, and that has been, I think, fair to say, redrafted from what it was in the original draft. And so I want to ask a little bit about that. I mean, you've got this broken down into construction, bonds and insurance, project implementation, and O&M. So to begin with, for project and implementation, you have planning and engineering at 8%, legal, admin, and environmental at 2%, and construction, CM, construction management at 7%. The question is, are these percentages of construction costs consistent with AACE principles?
I'm not sure that AAC lays out design budgets. The rest of the cost, the AAC really helps you understand the accuracy of these cost opinions, in the sense that, in this case, we're dealing with a Category 5 or a Class 5 cost opinion, which means that I'm preparing a cost opinion as an engineer without drawings, with very limited information.
Right.
And so therefore,
Really
it's
tough.
not a very accurate, right? It's going to have a wide range of accuracy. As we move towards a Class 1, which would be the cost opinion you prepare the day it goes out to bid, and or the cost opinion you get in from your contractor, that's more of a Class 1. And so you're going to have a fair amount of variability and accuracy as you move up that ladder from a Class 5 to a Class 1. So these are Class 5 cost opinions. I'd say that the 8, 2, and 7% is, I think ASCE does lay out some guidelines around helping owners budget for these types of upgrades. And these
They
are in
do,
line
because
with
they're
that.
quoted in the
Yeah,
plan.
Okay. So it's in line with that, yeah.
Okay, that's where I was going with it. Because the percentage, particularly on the legal, admin, and environmental side, is different than it was in June. So it's been decreased somewhat, which is good news when you've got a huge cost, huge expense coming. I want to focus for a couple minutes on alternative 2 versus alternative 3. And I have some difficulty with the recommendation for alternative 3 and thinking through this. And I note, for example, anecdotally, that the analysis of alternative 2 took all of 2 pages.
Yeah.
And it was on page 8-24 and 8-25, Alternative 2 Advantages and Disadvantages. One of the disadvantages that's quoted, and by the way, just so you know, I mean, where I'm coming from, Josh, is having represented sanitary district clients for almost 40 years, I've seen projects go through utilizing the Alternative 2 option, and it's gone just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I recognize that there are disadvantages to that and advantages to it. One of the advantages, if you go to Alternative 3, it's like an Etch-a-Sketch. You've got a clean canvas. And the plant that we have now has a lot of space to put these improvements on. Would you agree?
Yeah.
We wouldn't necessarily,
It's a major
for example,
advantage.
have to go to the 50-acre site next door.
Right.
Right? So there's plenty of room at the existing WRP. But it's also possible, isn't it, that that CSD could continue to operate its existing treatment process while continuing to build on that site as espoused under Alternative 2.
Potentially. I mean, I think what,
If you have construction, let's assume that you have construction sequencing and treatment sequencing done in an appropriately planned way. It would be possible to do that, correct, within regulatory constraints?
so let me see if I'm understanding. You're talking about, could you upgrade Plant 3 with Plant 3 operating in order to build the Alternative 2 out and make it work? Is that what you're looking,
Yeah.
I can't totally answer that right now. And that's really, I think, one of the big differences between 2 and 3, is that 3 has a lot more certainty with it, right? Plant 3 is not relying on an asset that's been out there for 30 to 40 years with an unknown, we don't know what's happening below the water level with that concrete at this point in time.
Right.
We don't really know what the full capacity of Plant 3 is at this time. We have a rough idea, but we haven't really vetted that out. And so what I'm proposing as we look at the work facility plan is that Alternative 3 right now is in the lead. It's in my mind, preferred. Why? Because I can tell you that one's going to work. I can't tell you right now that Alternative 2 is going to work. It might. And so what I think we want to do as we look at the facility plan is not leave Alternative 2 behind. Let's bring that forward still, and now let's flesh out Alternative 2 and Alternative 3 together. And as we do the stress testing that we're talking about out there at this next round, we'll get an idea for what is the real capacity of Plant 3 right now as it sits. And that's going to really inform then that next step. If that capacity is low, it'll help you drive what's going to happen there. And then we can lay out what types of alternative treatment technology might be able to be incorporated with that plant. Can we add additional treatment capacity in such a way that it integrates and creates a reliable, operable situation? So,
Right.
yeah.
I guess my response on that would be, given that the cost of 3 is materially higher than 2, by, if my math is
$20
correct,
million.
excess of $20 million, I need, and given the fact that you can't totally answer that question right now.
Right.
I have some real difficulty saying that Alternative 3 is the recommended approach until I know more, until you do that work. And so, for example, on page 8-24, under disadvantages of Alternative 2, it says in the second bullet, lowest opportunity for treatment and operational optimization because existing process train and technologies would not be modified. Yet, in the executive summary, it says on page ES-4, under Alternative 2, it says, improve the existing system by expanding the Plant 3 treatment process and improving the treatment processes to both increase treatment capacity and improve process performance. I can't reconcile the statement in the executive summary versus the statement in, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, sorry. I'm having a tough time reconciling those two statements. And from a process performance standpoint, which is where we've got to focus from a long term, I'm not able to answer that question yet, which is why I'm skeptical that Alternative 3 is the best way to go here. Do you
That's fair,
care to comment on my,
Yeah, I think what
maybe it's just late in the day and I'm having a tough time reconciling
Well,
statements.
I think what we're seeing here with that disadvantage is, depending on how Plant 3 plays out and how it could be improved, and we're talking very theoretical here, if you need to rely on the existing clarifiers, primary and secondary clarifiers, they would not be, right, you may not be able to optimize it because you're relying on existing clarification capacity. So
Right.
there may be limitations there in those assets that we're not contemplating at this point in time. We will be soon, but we aren't at the time of this document. So that's kind of what's meant there. So I think it's not a great statement. It's not the clearest statement that it could be. But there would need to be some assets within that existing treatment train that are reused in order to call it a hybrid solution, right? So if they're reusing the primary clarifiers and they have limitations or condition problems within those primary clarifiers, let's say, you may have to take them out and put in new ones entirely, depending on what those limitations are. So I think we're trying to kind of just capture that there, that if you're reusing existing assets, they may have issues with them that make it difficult to meet future regulatory requirements.
Well, but if I understand it correctly, I mean, wouldn't it be possible, though, to make the process improvements in such a way that it does meet the regulatory, or what we think may be future, using our crystal ball, regulatory requirements just as successfully as alternative 3? In other words,
Yeah.
what's the real difference?
I hear you. And the answer to that is, we don't know yet.
And that's where I'm having difficulty in terms of recommending alternative 3 over alternative 2, particularly given the cost, the material cost difference. So I'm just not there yet.
And I guess I just add one more thing, that I'm not sure that can be answered within this document. So if the recommendation needs to be shifted a little softer to say, evaluate alternative 2 and alternative 3 in the work facility plan as you look at the alternatives, that makes sense to me, to maybe dial that back a little bit. And if that wasn't coming through, that's currently the intent. So if we need to sort of soften that discussion a little bit, I know we're planning for the higher cost amount just to make sure that we're ready, but we do still need to dig into the details here and look at what type of technology you do for alternative 3. That may have an impact on cost, right? And then what type of hybrid would even be workable in an alternative 2 technology, and understanding what's happening at plant 3 would allow you to really design that then. And so we need to do that stress test of plant 3 in order to answer that question.
Right, so would you then, turning to chapter 11, and I'm on page 11-13, and turning your attention to that, and actually starting on page 11-11. So we've got the flow and load study, I understand that. We'd have an interim operations plan, a building improvements plan, and a biosolids facility plan. But would you expect the discussion or the study of alternatives 2 versus alternative 3 to be in the WRP upgrades facility plan?
Yes.
To be completed by winter of 2023?
Correct.
Okay.
And that's where that line item 1, expand and explore the alternatives evaluated in the master plan by performing a detailed evaluation of the various treatment technology alternatives and citing options of alternative 3, and it goes on to there. And
Yeah.
so that could be 2 and 3.
Right, the difficulty that I had is that had only alternative 3 in it. It
that's
did
fair.
not have alternative 2, and so I'm not supportive of that unless alternative 2 is in there with alternative 3. And I know we're getting late, so, that's enough questions for me for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, I only have a couple of questions that other people didn't hit. Let's talk about composting. I noticed that it appeared to me on the diagrams that there was a real effort to keep everything on the site of the current plant. I happened to have been here when we bought the adjacent 50 acres. The plan at that time was that we were going to compost there. Things didn't work out for a lot of different reasons. And I'm also coming at this from the experience that it seems every 10, 12, 15 years, the state wants everybody to do a survey of all the land they own, and then you try to figure out how the state can get your land. And so is there a reason why we're saving that 50 acres? And if we weren't trying hard to keep everything on the current site, would there be a better use for the 50 acres? Could we put the composting or something over there? I'm just asking.
So just real quick on the composting side, in chapter 9, it does kind of look at, hey, if you use that 50 acres for disposal of, and land application or composting, it looks like it's very likely adequate for that. It needs more detail, but it looks like it's large enough that you could compost and then dispose of it, spread it on that land. So that's envisioned in here. I think understanding the flood improvements is really a big, important next step in understanding what happens on that adjacent 50-acre parcel. So, flood improvements or flood impacts to the future plant, while I think that the future plant's relatively large and should have room to accommodate it, if flooding impacts that could push some of the plant onto the adjacent parcel. Not the whole 50 acres, but, it could push it a little onto that parcel. So I think there's still some, at least my intent as we laid this out was that we would be, in this next step, in the facility planning study, really looking at that site selection and understanding, both on the biosolid side and on the liquid stream side, how much do you need of that 50-acre parcel? How important is it to the future plant, and what would you do with it? But Dave may have more to add if he's got anything with regards to that.
Right, just in general, the master planning effort here is not laid out to exclude future use of that 50-acre site. And I would agree with you, the focus being on within the existing site, we definitely need to fully explore the use of the existing site, knowing that there is the ability and potential for using a portion of that 50-acre site. Josh brings up a really good point, and council has been aware for some time. We've had a study and progressing forward, implementing some flood protection improvements. That's continuing to advance. Also now with master plan catching up, we're going to continue to look at the most optimal way to achieve flood protection improvements, and that may impact the amount of usable space on the existing site and possibly shift some of the improvements, ultimate improvements, onto the 50 acres. So we're not excluding the use of that at all in the future. Including, and I will mention it, I think it did come up at the committee meeting on the different options for handling the biosolids, the end result, and council is well aware, you've toured a facility that changes that output into a pelletized fertilizer product. That is a potential option that is not being excluded at this time either.
Okay, that was my next question, because it just seemed from the way everything I read was going as we're going to do all this here on site, whereas if we partnered with somebody else, and there are other companies that do what Synagro does, we wouldn't need some of that that's being talked about in this plan.
Correct. Right. So again, I guess back to the general statement is the master planning effort at this point does not exclude those possibilities in the future.
Okay. So I'm not asking for another round of questions. We've had a lot of questions. Is there discussion? Is there a motion?
Your Honor,
And then we'll take comments from each. We do need to hear from the public. I don't have any cards. Is there any member of the public who would like to speak to us on this issue? I don't see anyone coming forward. So,
Your Honor,
Mr. Kildee.
I'll make a motion that we adopt a CSD resolution approving the wastewater master plan.
Is there a second?
I will second.
There's a motion and a second. I would like to ask if there are any comments on the motion. Mr. Tremblay.
I would be willing to support that if you considered amending the motion to require that in the WRP upgrades facility plan that there be a specific review done of both alternatives 2 as well as 3.
Yeah, I'll make that amendment. My understanding is that that's going to happen regardless, but I certainly, if you'd like to make it stronger, I can certainly support that.
Well, if it's in the motion, it will happen.
That's what I'm doing. I'm making it stronger.
I'm fine with that.
Does the second accept that?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, are there any other comments? My comments have, I'm going to make my comments after, so if there are no further comments, please vote. I can't see Mr. Kildees. I'm assuming he voted yes, so that carries unanimously. I just want to say a couple of things. There was an assumption that inflation is going to take everything up. Let me tell you, we've had times of inflation and times of recession. And the last 2 times we improved that plant, major improvements, just happened to be at the right time when contractors were very hungry. And our bids all came in both times, much, much less. And so you never know what's going to happen. You can't just assume that prices are going to climb, 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 climb. And the other thing that I want to say is I will not be here, I'm sure, when you're making future decisions on this. But I want to tell you that even though Josh talked about we have to have time-proven and tested technologies, there's always somebody out there who comes in and you're at the league or you're here or you're there and they're going to tempt you with some brand-new process. And man, they're going to give you a great deal because you're going to be the one to test it. And don't let them fool you at all. That's what happened with our plant number 2. The plant wasn't very old when we realized that the thing just plain wasn't working. It was new, it was innovative, it was going to be cutting edge, and it bombed. So what you don't want, the things that people want the most are for the potholes to be filled, the water to keep running, and the toilets to keep flushing. And when you keep having spills and overflows because the toilets can't flush, you're in big trouble. So I'm asking you now, I'm advising you now, please go with time-tested and proven technologies, whatever you decide in the future. Those are my comments. Oral communications? None? Okay, with that, this meeting will adjourn.
And we will reconvene the meeting of the Camarillo City Council. What we have left on this, our 5 o'clock agenda is oral communications. I'm tempted to push that to 7 o'clock.
Yep.
So, because I know that, Charlotte, you have a little bit to talk about. I know Tony has quite a bit to talk about on water. So I wanted to consider everyone's timing and also give us a little bit of opportunity to stretch and take a break before 7 o'clock. So I'm going to recess to our 7 o'clock, and we'll do oral communications after public comments. So this time we'll stand to recess. for our 7 o'clock session. Let the record reflect that all council members are present. And we're going to jump right into public comments. I do have a few cards here. And so I will call up everyone in the order in which I received the cards. If there's anyone here who hasn't given me a card and wants to submit a public comment, please do so. So we'll start with, and I've mispronounced your name, please correct me, I apologize. Nicholas Bednarski. All right, and just so everyone knows the ground rules, you have a clock, I think, below me. I have a clock below you. It'll start at 3 minutes. It'll start to count down. I think when it gets to 1 minute, or maybe it's even 30 seconds now. It's 1 minute. When it gets to 1 minute, you'll see a buzzer and a light, yellow flash. Don't let that interrupt you. You can continue on going. Then once it gets to 0, I'm going to ask that you can conclude your comments, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. So that way it's equitable for everyone. And go ahead.
Thanks to the council. I'm Nicholas Bednarski, a 32-year resident of Camarillo. 2 issues regarding water. Firstly, although I realize you don't have jurisdiction, I want to raise publicly the issue that California American Water has apparently been overcharging residential customers for water usage for as long as 11 months. I became aware of this when a technician recently notified us he had installed a reporting meter and that prior water billings were based on estimates. We received a partial refund for that month, but then when I reviewed the following bills, I discovered that all billings up until that time had been estimated since August of 2021. In fact, in the month that meter was installed, 2 of the weeks were estimated, 2 of the weeks were measured. We used 845 gallons per day, 2 people in our household. In the following month, with 9 people in the household because of a month's visit by relatives, we used 527 gallons a day. By my estimate, we may have been overcharged for as much as 70,000 gallons since August of 2021. I'm aware that many of my neighbors have also complained of the same issue on Nextdoor.com, and I have filed this issue with the Ventura County Board of Supervisors and an informal complaint with the California Public Utilities Commission. I hope for notice and action in some fashion by the Camarillo City Council, even though I realize that is not in your jurisdictional authority. The second issue is just a request regarding new developments in the area. I know that you consider many factors, especially environmental impacts and traffic impacts, and I'm sure somewhere in that data is probably data regarding water usage and electricity usage. But no mention in previous meetings that I've attended is ever made in the discussion of these regarding the expected water usage and electricity usage in these new housing units. I would ask that you consider mentioning this publicly in future discussions regarding new housing, as it reflects 2 very short assets that we have in our state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Debbie Morris, you are up, and Debbie Garrison, you are on deck.
Good evening, council members. So what happened? Over the 5 years ago, in January 2017, this city council denied a request to build a housing project on the Camarillo Springs Golf Course, as there was no project plan submitted. The owner had threatened to close golf course. He didn't receive an approval that night. The city council invited this developer, New Urban West, back if the plan was conceived. That September, New Urban West returned with a plan, and it was admitted as GPA 217 for study. It's been nearly 5 years since that sad night, and no vote on the plan has occurred. A vote was made in September 2020 to rescind GPA 2017-2, as the owner, again, had threatened to close the golf course if he didn't get his way. The project was saved 3-2 to concerns over possible legal ramifications, and New Urban West promised to keep up, manage, and keep the course open. Council members Craven and Kildee solidly voted to rescind the GPA. That same September, an EIR was released for a 45-day review and comment period. The EIR created many questions and answered very few. During the same time, a disaster involving crude oil was exposed within the golf course. Included were the wildlife deaths in the Killer Pond, the existence of over 80 ancient swallowed crude oil wells that which were insufficiently capped. Additionally, there were concerns about crude oil leaking in Canal Creek towards the wetlands in CSU Channel Islands. Just recently, it was confirmed New Urban West yet has 83 questions submitted to the EIR that they just kind of excused. New Urban West has not submitted a flood control plan sufficient for approval. Still, we have yet to begin exploring the challenges such as evacuation, water consumption, wildlife, known endangered species, soil carcinogens, native tribal objections, and neighboring property owners solidly rejecting this project. The suggestion by Joe Vaca, the Director of Community Development, has been to me, start over, make a new EIR. Would that be a do-over? Opposed Camarillo Springs building is now 700 registered members strong.
Thank you, Debbie. I have to cut you off. Debbie Garrison, you are up, and Terry Denson, you are on deck.
Good evening. Several months prior to April 13th, the Camarillo City Council conducted a review of the progress made with the Camarillo Springs Golf Course project. 88 questions resulted from the 1.5-year-old environmental impact report, which is still being ignored by NUI. Since the most vulnerable and controversial part of the NUI project is their flood control plan, it was the focus. The city and other officials were unable to accept the NUI factors and measurements made in the EIR proposal. An engineer in charge with a third-party consulting firm presented their independent findings. After their presentation, Councilmember Tremblay asked the engineer many questions about the mechanics, equipment used, and the risk of failure associated with the NUI plan. The consulting company admitted that they felt the NUI plan was weak and risky in terms of future flooding. The lake they propose as one of their flood water reservoirs may need to be classified as a dam in California. This would require exorbitant construction and expensive to maintain. Flap gates were recommended to keep debris from entering the drainage pipes, but were dismissed by the consultant. NUI's plan for a stormwater staging pool alongside Camarillo Springs Road must be relieved by installing more drainage pipes. The 10 to 15-foot high earthen pad built below their homes must be constructed as a levee, which dramatically increases its cost to build and to maintain. There are also significant concerns about rodents burrowing away the strength of the berms. The owners of the neighboring Hiji Farms presented the city of Camarillo with a letter claiming that the NUI flood control plan will negatively affect their property and they will not allow the plan's approval. No provision has been made as to who will pay for the maintenance of the flood control equipment after the developer is gone. Its cost would surely be more than what a new HOA could afford. Then what? 14 opposed Camarillo Springs building teammates presented a 3-minute presentation on that night on April 13th, and all ended with this request. Considering the many flaws in this incredibly dubious NUI plan, we homeowners and taxpayers ask that the Camarillo City Council make a motion tonight to deny GPA 2017-2, second the motion, and vote at your earliest convenience. Let's be done with it, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Terry Denson, you are up, and Patricia McGarry, you're on deck.
On April 13th, it was clear that approving GPA 2017-2 would be a colossal informed mistake. It would leave the taxpayers of Camarillo vulnerable to enormous maintenance expenses and uninsured damages. At the conclusion of the public comments that night, Councilman Tremblay announced that he would formally request that the city manager schedule a vote to deny Newey's project. He added that, given procedural requirements, the vote would be held within just a few weeks. This took courage and initiative, but it was the right thing to do. But days later, Newey requested yet another opportunity to revise their flood control plan. Councilman Tremblay backpedaled and announced he would delay the vote until receiving the revision. So much for courage and initiative. Of course, the revision included only a few tweaks, adding even more complexity to overcome the major obstacles presented on April 13th. The property owner also sent yet another threatening letter to add pressure, all designed to increase delays. Well, it seems like it has worked. It's now 15 weeks later, and there has been no discussion nor vote on Newey's proposal. Only the sound of silence is coming from Councilman Tremblay and the rest of the City Council. Councilman Tremblay, where is your promise to schedule the vote? What are you and the other council members waiting for? What don't we understand? Oh, but wait, we do understand. There's a political tradition of delaying controversial decisions until after an election. Mayor Molche and Councilmember Santangelo are up for re-election in November. Are they concerned about the bad optics associated with the threatened closure of the golf course before the election? Are they worried that campaigning on what is right for the city of Camarillo against well-financed opponents determined to see the Newey project approved despite the facts? It's hard to believe our city council would delay important city business and kick the can down the road just to help or hinder other council members' election campaigns. Clearly, oppose will be involved in the upcoming campaign. We don't have the money that Newey and the golf course owner are willing to spend, but we have the votes. Please finish what you started, Councilman Tremblay. We still have the highest regard for our city council members. Bring your courage and determination to do what is right for the city of Camarillo back to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Patricia McGarry, you are up, and Bellarue McGarry, you're on deck.
Last City Council meeting, I spoke about the VCSD and their treatment of the homeless. On the live stream, there is no visual during my speech. It continues to show the stay tuned screen until halfway through the second speaker. Anyone scanning for visuals to watch my public comments would completely miss my speaking. Interesting. A couple nights later, after 1 a.m., somebody lit a fire about 3 feet from the back of the RV behind us. I called 911. The first responding officer was dismissive of the seriousness of this arson, suggesting someone was trying to cook. I asked, why would somebody decide to do that behind a stranger's RV? He responded with, why would somebody live over here in an RV? I attempted to get the body cam footage to show this and was denied by Captain Matthews and told even with the FOIA request, they would come up with a few statutes of why I can't have it. Transparency, Commander Tennyson? Then, a few days later, 5 members of the VCSD were there passing out warning citations to move or else with a special registration ticket for us. When asked who sent them, he responded, the city of Camarillo. This time I was prepared with my own recording. One of the largest business owners in the city even tried to speak to them. Their response, I don't have to speak with you. And then foisting responsibility on him by telling him he can buy us a piece of land and we can live there. I sent a copy of that recording in a letter to the city council, city manager, city clerk, community development, even Supervisor Linda Parks for our own protection. Who responded? No one. Harassment tickets we can't afford. This reeks of slap tactics. That's SLAPP for those unfamiliar who want more info. Inscrutably ludicrous. Imagine the anxiety a parent must feel traveling to get supplies necessary to live and retain the small semblance of dignity that hasn't yet been stolen from us. Then having to worry the whole time the cops will steal their van because they don't have a physical address. And dad unable to come because they may decide to take their home while they're gone. The anxiety the kids feel worrying about cops taking their home because they've seen it in others before and even came to this council to speak about it to no avail. These children are the witnesses to the VCSD's treatment of the homeless, the harassment, the disregard, the ignorance. I am putting this council and the city at all on notice of Title 42, Sections 1983 to 1985 of the United States Code. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Bellarue McGarry, you are up, and Timothy McGarry, you're on deck.
These so-called policemen are making it uncomfortable for me and my parents to go to the store and get food and water to survive this crazy world. I call them so-called policemen because they are not doing their job at all. And I thought Falco was supposed to help the homeless. Silly me. And when we do go to the store, Dad stays because he's scared the cops are going to tow our home. I don't know about you, but I treat others how I want to be treated. Thank you.
Thank you, Bellarue. Timothy McGarry, you are up, and that's the last comment card I have.
Hello, Mr. Kildee, Ms. Santangelo, Mr. Mulshay, Ms. Craven, Mr. Tremblay. I'm sure you didn't expect to see me again after that stunt. Not 6 days after speaking here, 5 VCSD vehicles swarmed that tiny edge of the city that we've been relegated to, what are we dubbing this? Sweep the refuse? Let the record reflect there was no objection. They come down there to write citations, only to the autos owned by the homeless, of course, in an unprecedented show of force for that area. Anyone here know the definition of retaliation? I'm sure she does. I bet the whole time the officers flouting the city's own ordinances. Anyone in the city who's been written a ticket recently for crossing double yellows, illegal U-turn, or exhibition of speed, there's a video of a deputy and a few cadets doing just that you might want to have your attorney get from me. Courtesy of Sergeant Gonzalez in the city of Camarillo, of course. Rules for thee, but not for me. Do not make the mistake of thinking I come here in ignorance, that I don't know the stakes. I am fully and well aware that in an instant, on a whim, any one of you could decide that my children don't deserve a roof over their head, that they don't deserve a soft place to lie their head or a place to prepare and cook food. I am fully aware of the power you yield and the corresponding danger that my family is in. But I also believe in a God that put David in front of Goliath. And the one thing my children will never learn from me is how to back down from a bully. And I do not use that term flippantly, because it's a fairly safe assumption that an individual, much less a family, that cannot afford rent would also not be able to afford an attorney. Maybe not even the filing fees to even try to defend their human dignity. You may think I'm giving in to hyperbole or lending towards exaggeration. Had you seen the fear, the anxiety, the anger that stunt put in my children's eyes? Had you counted the tears before their sister's birthday this past Monday? Maybe you wouldn't be so quick to dismiss these parents' experience. To them that have had the experience, no explanation is necessary. To they that have had not, apparently, none is possible. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. McGarry. That is it on comment cards. Does anyone else in the chamber want to speak before the city council? Seeing none come forward, we don't have, well, I'm sorry, I I pushed our oral communications to the 7 o'clock agenda, so we will take that up at this time. And I'm just going to kind of take people out of order this time. I always go from one end to the other or whatnot. Ms. Angela, you mind if we start with you?
I'm happy to start. For meetings attended, the Airport Authority on July 14th, CPA Executive Committee, July 20th, Economic Development and Land Use Committee, July 22nd, and on July 16th, I got to introduce for the concert in the park, which was fantastic. It was so great to see so many people out there, and I think everybody really enjoyed Forever Rod. I just want to respond to one of the things said tonight in public comments, because I don't like the accusation that I'm doing anything to delay on purpose. And at this point, I would actually like to ask, maybe our city manager could talk a little bit about the process with the GPA referral, and how we can't just make a motion. We can't do things as you're asking them to be done, and because we have city policies and ordinances. But I assure you that I am doing nothing, absolutely nothing, to delay, impede, or put this off down the road.
Sure, thank you. Yes, the City Council does have a policy that regulates and memorializes how a rescission of a general plan amendment does take place, and that's a couple different actions that you have to take place. So it couldn't happen tonight. It would have to take place at a regularly scheduled meeting. As far as the status of the environmental document for the Camp Springs project, it is in process. There were changes made to the last submittal by NUI. That is being evaluated now. They still need to supply us with amendments to their tentative track map, as well as grading plan and other things, so that we could further that analysis. There are significant changes to that environmental document. If it is to proceed, it would need to be recirculated with further analysis, so that the public has a chance to comment on it, and brought back to the council after that is done. I expect that we certainly have the option to provide status updates to the council. We just don't have enough information at this point to do that, but that's not to say that won't happen in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kildee?
Yeah, okay, so committees attended VRSD July 21st, and today the investment committee meeting I attended as well. We did have a report from Jason on our investments, and I know a lot of people are really interested in the economy right now, and I believe it was before the Fed's raised the interest rate, I think, by 75 basis points here, but his suggestion is stay the course, and we're going through a really interesting time with the economy, and he spent a lot of time talking about this unusual kind of economy where we have a very strong job growth at this particular point, but yet we've got an inflation rate that is a real challenge here too. So stay the course, and I always enjoy listening to him and listen to those folks that do this for a living. So that was that. I do have a question. I think maybe Mr. Klotzel can answer this, or any staff. Do we have a little update on the pavement management program, how the resurfacing and rehabbing the streets are going in the various areas around the city? If you wouldn't mind, Mr. Klotz, I appreciate it.
Sure. Yes, we are in the final couple weeks of the actual slurry seal application, and that's going to be followed up with restriping, where the restriping is required because of the new slurry. So that project is progressing well and is in there, will be finished up in the next few weeks.
Good. All right. Thank you. And then with council concurrence, if we could adjourn tonight in the memory of Terry DeWolf and I think a lot of us know Terry. Terry was Santa Claus, I believe, at the Cam Ranch. He did various things. He's a real, mover and shaker around the city. He was also on the Arts Council for many, many years. And he was Historical Society member for many years, lived in Old Town, very supportive of the council, and one of the really, truly good people out there. If we had more Terry DeWolfs in the world, we would not have any wars and a lot of the other stuff that we seem to have now. Terry was just a really good, solid, down-to-earth person, and he loved living in Camarillo. So with concurrence of the council, if we can adjourn in his memory. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tremblay?
So I've got a little bit of a report on water that I need to get to you since from a drought task force response. But before I go there, let me just, on meetings attended, July 14th, the CASA Statewide Board of Directors, July 19th, the Utilities Committee with Mayor Moshe, July 20, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee with Mayor Moshe. You see a pattern emerging. July 22, Metrolink Board of Directors meeting, and on July 27, today, we had a drought task force meeting that Callegas sponsored, and the member agencies within Callegas were represented during that meeting. I want to spend a few minutes discussing some of the water issues. Carrie, I know you're going to be putting something up on the board. Okay, I'll get to that in just a minute. Right? Is there a different document prior to that? Okay, well, let me sort of bring you forward without going to that yet. We'll hold on that for a minute if we can, Carrie. On July 19, the Utilities Committee, the mayor and myself, together with city staff, staff from Callegas and Camarosa, met with senior Metropolitan Water District staff, including the general manager, chief engineer, et cetera. And we discussed the issues that the mayor put forth in his May 29th letter, and you recall that the basic issue there is that while Metropolitan had adequate water in storage, it's unable to move water to our area because of inadequate conveyance infrastructure. And the flip side of that is called equitable supply reliability, because while there are approximately 20 million Metropolitan Water District customers, 6 million of those customers, including those in our area, are in what's called the State Water Project dependent area. And under the current restrictions of the one day per week irrigation or after irrigation watering, and 14 million of the Metropolitan Water District customers are not currently under those restrictions. Although I will say, I think with things moving right now, particularly with regard to Colorado River supplies, we can probably expect, I would think, and this is my own belief, that probably within the next 30 to 60 days, there will be additional restrictions placed across the board on Metropolitan Water District customers. But the fact of the matter is there's inadequate conveyance and infrastructure to our area, and the mayor was loud and clear. We were all loud and clear about that in our letter of May 29th. The mayor's letter of May 29th precipitated a very positive response from Metropolitan, acknowledging that I'll just call it the connectivity issue exists, the infrastructure issue exists, and pledging to work with us. That was followed by a letter from a coalition of member agencies in the Callegas area supporting our mayor's May 29th letter and supporting the city of Camarillo's position on this. So on bringing it fast forward, on July 19th, the Utilities Committee met, and we've actually had 2 meetings now with Metropolitan staff, but I want to focus principally on the July 19th meeting. The Met staff provided, and I would say in good faith, provided their view of what they intend to, or what they are thinking at that point that they're going to take to their board at the Metropolitan Water District's board meeting of August 16th. And their board letter for that August 16th meeting will be out on August 9th. There was also a committee meeting preceding on August 15, preceding the August 16 board meeting. And there are kind of 2 parallel tracks that they're pursuing. One is phase 1, improving the Venice, the Sepulveda-Venice pump station project to try to move additional water our way. And that would increase, ultimately, that would increase the water coming to Ventura County by about 35 CFS, which is not a huge amount, but it is more than what is coming our way now. But it is about a 3 to 4 year project. Between that and some improvements at the Burbank station, about a 3 to 4 year project, and it's also partially dependent on some legislation that's pending in Sacramento right now, AB 1845, which is in the Senate Appropriations Committee. We all know that from a public contract standpoint, public contract code standpoint, public entities have to do things a certain way, like we have to design, bid a project, and then build it. This particular legislation would allow for basically a progressive design build by Metropolitan. And Metropolitan has its own special act, so they have to have a law written specifically for them. Anyway, that legislation appears to be going through, but it's important to this process. A second project that they're looking, and that's about there's no Hail Mary here in terms of, right now, things happening. That's about probably somewhere between a 2 to 3 to 4 year project. There's also a longer-term project by which that same pump stations and the Sepulveda feeder would be increased by up to 300 CFS, which is a materially higher amount, although realistically it would be less, probably in the 100 to 200 CFS range, and that is about a 10-year project. Carrie, is the drought test, is anything from, no, that's all right, well, let's not start it yet. There were some PowerPoints that the Metropolitan shared with us showing the milestones, the timing for their decisions. They're going to be considering by resolution at their August meeting how they plan to move forward on these projects. And then we would expect in September some more discrete or specific information coming forward on those projects. And if all goes according to plan, we are hoping that by February of next year, they will greenlight, if that's the appropriate term, they will move forward with these projects. We have been insisting since day one that we want a specific commitment of funds, specific projects, and a specific timeline. And so they have been receptive to our concerns, and there are a number of things that they need to do. We specifically asked during our July 19th Utilities Committee meeting that they provide a roadmap to their Metropolitan Water District Board, which is made up of 38 members, provide a roadmap on how they're going to, what the issue is and how they're going to solve it. And they committed to doing that. So we're waiting to see what happens on August 9th. Meanwhile, and so the bottom line is there is no immediate physical solution, but MWD realizes that this is more than just they acknowledge that there is a connectivity project and that they have water in storage and can't get it to us. That's the bottom line. What I want to discuss with you next is what came up in the Drought Task Force meeting this morning. And Carrie, okay, now finally we can do the PowerPoint. Copies have been provided to you both of the Drought Task Force agenda from this morning. It was rather lengthy. And then a smaller thing, which Carrie now has up on the board, and this is from the MW website today. And you recall that in terms of tracking the water use by Callegas member water agencies and all the state water dependent water agencies, Metropolitan is tracking their use compared to what is, in essence, a volumetric allocation target. And I've talked about that before, so I won't go into that at length. But for the month of June, and as of the cumulative water use as of July 19, what that indicates is that the member agencies within Callegas Municipal Water District, and that includes City of Camarillo, includes Camarosa, includes others, are actually 17% over what that target allocation should be. Las Virgenes is 38% over. But on a combined basis, can we go to the next? So if you look at this is the emergency water conservation tracking side, and this is what Callegas in their resolution in April, the Callegas board adopted was the emergency water conservation resolution. And they're tracking the use of all state water. On the left-hand side is all state water dependent agencies. as of July 22, and then on the right-hand side, the Callegas member agencies as of July 22. And you'll see that all state water project dependent agencies within MET are actually utilizing 5% under what the target allocation is, which is good. On the right-hand side, Callegas is at 15% over. So that's why you see the bottom, at the very bottom of this graph, Southeast Ventura County, 15% over target for July. So we got work to do. Carrie, could you go to the next slide? Yeah, that's it, thanks. Okay, so, but this slide shows a little bit more, actually a little better news, which is that for this period of June through December, or at least, well, we haven't gotten to December 2022 yet, but during this period to date, it's all state water project dependent areas within Metropolitan are 4% under target. Why is that important? Because Metropolitan looks at this from a metropolitan, state water project dependent, the entire area, not just the Callegas area, not just the Las Virgenes area, but the entire area. So if all of the SWP dependent agencies are on target, if this continues, one comment that was made by Callegas this morning is there may not be the impetus to go to a 0-day per week irrigation decision that we talked about last time, because the Metropolitan is going to have to make that decision in September, whether it wants to move from a 1 day per week to a 0 days per week. No outdoor irrigation. Remember, they are very turf focused. It's not really on your trees and your shrubs, it's on turf, and that's why we see everybody's brown lawns around town, all right? Can we go to the next slide, Carrie? Okay, this is the drought supply update and report, and that's as of July 20. It says many of the same things, and you'll see that the city of Camarillo is 9% under on that, which is good news. Councilmember Kildee, you asked at the last meeting about the city of Oxnard and why the city of Oxnard was so far under. And on that chart, you'll note that they right now are at about 54% under their targeted level. And that's obviously, good news from Oxnard's standpoint and good news area-wide. My understanding, and I knew you were going to come back and ask me, well, okay, so Tony, why is that? And I figured you'd ask it at this meeting. So there are a number of factors that have gone into that. My understanding is two principal factors. One, my understanding, and maybe Mr. Klotzel could comment on this if he wishes, is that Oxnard has changed its blending ratios. In other words, it's blending in it blends state water, project water, and groundwater. And it is blending less state water and extracting more and utilizing more groundwater at this point. So their groundwater blend is more groundwater centric, I guess, or focused. Concomitantly, that means the state water project portion of that has gone down, which is one reason why you see. Second is that there's been a very strong conservation signaling message within the city of Oxnard. And the city is also, but it's hard to know how much effect this has really had. They've really focused on their city facilities in terms of trying to save water. But it's hard to know how much difference that really makes. But it's hard to know what goes into that 54%. I'm not sure what's gone into our 9% to date. But that's the answer to the question I knew you were going to ask about the 54%. But you'll notice that retailers are kind of all over the board, aren't they, in terms of their ability to comply on reduction of imported water use. Carrie, could we go to the next one? So there, in much easier print to understand, is the tracking for all the different retailers. Now, that's with a concept known as demand shaping, which I don't want to take the next hour to go into that. But basically, it's a list of all the purveyors in the area, including City of Camarillo and Camarillo Water District, et cetera, and Oxnard and so on. And you see some folks who have work to do, including Cal American, Cal Water Service, et cetera, in terms of their compliance. Remember, too, that there are areas that are completely dependent upon state water project water. whereas Camarillo is not. City of Camarillo is not, neither is Camarosa. Camarillo has a blend, and with the desalter coming into operation, we can always ask Mr. Klotz about the latest timeline on that. It seems like we ask you that every meeting, Dave, and we're looking forward to that, and I know that there's still some, I guess, some DDW testing to be done. But you could expect, and I'm wondering whether or not we may be able to, the amount of state water that the city is currently buying is going to go all the way down to about 13% imported water, ultimately when that is fully in operation, and that's really good news in terms of cutting our state water, but we're still going to be partially reliant on state water, which means that the city is still going to be subject to these restrictions because it does receive state water. Carrie, can you go to the next? So one of the important things is that there is a letter, and I know you got hard copies of the packet. I want to thank Ms. Buckstemper for getting you hard copies of the packet, but there is a letter from there, from Metropolitan Water District to California Department of Water Resources, which is requesting 26,300 acre feet of supplemental water to help mitigate wildfire risks, because we're heading into wildfire season, and there needs to be additional supplies. And in that packet, by the way, are additional letters from other cities in the area. I think Hidden Hills and Agoura Hills and elsewhere also supporting that request for additional health and safety water. Next slide. This is kind of an interesting slide because it sort of shows in a stark way Metropolitan's requesting of additional health and human services supplies for the Callegas service area and specifically for fire prevention for the Callegas area. And the red areas are where we're in a moderate to high area, but you can see obviously the areas to the east of us, Newbury Park and Thousand Oaks, for example, are in a very much of a fire hazard, high fire hazard severity zone. And then finally, last slide. Interestingly enough, I found out today that apparently there is technology that exists that lets Google chart out whether or not the soils in all of our areas are dry, and they can even chart out to the different houses on whether those soils are dry, which is one way that and it was within the context of a discussion on enforcement and education, I guess I should say first, and enforcement. And you know, this may be something that's in the future relative to encouraging people to save more water. Finally, what's in your packet, but Carrie, I think that's the last slide on the board, right? You should be aware that Callegas has now gone, as of last Friday, to the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency, and they have informed the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency that in accordance with Callegas's authority, they intend to recover they intend to recover 2,600 to 5,300 acre feet of the almost 22,000 acre feet of imported water stored in the Las Posas Valley groundwater basin via direct injection. And remember, that was the quote-unquote ASR project that Callegas engaged in several years ago. Actually, those ASR facilities and the stored water were purchased by Callegas back from Met for about $50 million back in 2011. And one of the things we've been talking to Met about is, hey, bring some of that money back to reinvest. But the good news is Callegas is starting to do that extraction, and my understanding is that as of and feeding that water into the system, they started that last Thursday. They've been working with GMA staff on approvals. The maximum flow that they will get to when they're doing these is an additional 16 CFS. If you multiply that by 2, it's about 32 acre feet per day. That's what comes up. So, you know, 325,000 or 326,000 gallons is an acre foot. So, you know, you can do the math. I can't do the mental math that quickly for 326,000 by 32 acre feet. But they will get to that extraction. The way to think of it is if there's 1 CFS, it's 2 acre feet. It's a little bit less than that, but that's close enough for ballpark purposes. But the good news is that Callegas will be reaching that figure tomorrow and intends to continue that extraction, as the letters point out to you, for the rest of this year. So that will have the effect of feeding additional water into the Callegas system. Next meeting of the drought. Task Force response. Hopefully I got that right. Drought Task Force response. Drought Response Task Force is August 24. So I'll brief you at the next I guess our next council meeting is 3 days after that. And by that time, too, we will know what Metropolitan Water District specifically is doing with respect to rectifying the conveyance infrastructure deficiency for our area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll save Charlotte to last. She's got a good.
Oh, I'm not nearly as long as Tony.
Oh, okay. Good.
I didn't think she would be.
For me, meetings attended July 14th, Airport Authority with Ms. Santangelo, July 19th, Utilities Committee with Mr. Trembling, which he just very thoroughly reviewed with us, July 20th, Transportation and Infrastructure with Mr. Tremblay, July 22nd, Economic Development and Land Use Committee with Ms. Santangelo. Following that, I got to tour Meisner Filtration. We've resumed business visits, and so we started with Meisner and off of Flynn. They have multiple buildings now, kind of off of Flynn. That was a really cool tour. Got to learn a lot about what they did. I vaguely knew what they did before. I know a lot more in depth what they do and how their operation works. And they have about 800 employees total, most of which work in and around here in Camarillo. I think they have their 5 buildings, right? Yeah, they have 5 buildings now in Camarillo, and they just keep growing. There's not a building large enough to hold them as all. So they just keep buying or leasing properties in and around their main headquarters there off Flynn. But they're great. So we got to talk with them, what they want to see, what is important to them in the city, and how we operate. But they love Camarillo. They want to retain as much of their business in Camarillo. They have a little satellite in Ireland. But aside from that, pretty much home is Camarillo, and they anticipate to keep it that way. So they really like our city. They talk to us just about needs for them, needs for their employees, just top-of-mind issues, transportation, housing, stuff like that. But we had a really great conversation, and maybe what would be, I would recommend that there's a way, because we can't all kind of tour together, kind of be a meeting. But for those of us who do go, it'd be really nice if we could give some sort of report to, from staff to the rest of the council members, just vaguely outlining some of that. I think that'd be really fruitful, especially when it comes to the type of feedback we're getting from those business owners and what their concerns are, needs are, compliments are, what we're doing right and wrong. So I think that'd be really beneficial. I've been getting a few calls. I've already spoken to staff about it as well, in regards to some residents who want to, in light of the water restrictions and the 1 day a week watering for 15 minutes, and let's be honest, it's for most people, it's not enough to keep their lawns green. And we're going to have a lot of brown and dying lawns out there. There's several people that are looking at that as maybe an opportunity. My lawn's going to die anyway. Maybe this is a good time for me to reapproach what I have in my yard, front yard, backyard, whatever. And maybe I need to reanalyze how much grass I have. And that this drought and these water restrictions are probably going to be with us for a very long time. We shouldn't expect the drought to go away anytime soon. The one question I got posed, and I'm going to pose it, Greg, I'll ask you, and whether you or staff, who can answer me. What is the city doing as it pertains to long-term planning when it comes to landscape requirements and the like? I know we revised landscape requirements in 2015, and we changed them dramatically to be more accommodating in light of water restrictions, drought conditions, and the like. Have we done anything since then? Are we looking any further? We've been talking a lot about supply, and that is a significantly concern, but how can we continue to reduce the demand, especially when it comes to the demand on landscaping? And is there, as we discussed about how we can better approach that, if there is a better approach than what we're already pursuing?
No, we haven't. Our focus has been clearly on conservation, and that's been our focus so far. At this point, we have not looked at landscape guidelines as an example. I think that's a policy decision on the council's part as to whether or not you all want to amend those or change those. They were changed in 2015. At this point, our focus has solely been on conservation and reducing the amount of water people are using outside.
I'm digging into those and educating myself as prior to my time on the council and the discussion and everything and what those are right now. What I would ask or request of staff is if we can do more to educate people, get the word out, is if they are pursuing, they want to consider rehabbing their yard, eliminating grass, where they can get information. I know Be Waterwise, and we direct people to Be Waterwise. A lot of people still don't know of that resource, and a lot of people don't know of any of our requirements as to what, if they're going to pursue that, what they can and cannot do. I think most people probably just do it and ask for forgiveness as opposed to permission. But if we can help lead some people to water on that, then I think that'd be very beneficial. And we may even encourage a lot of people to pursue, rehabbing their yard and to be a little bit more drought tolerant.
Yeah, understood. And I think staff is looking into better ways to communicate the conservancy part of it, as well as different options and whatnot. So we're evaluating those now. As far as an educational perspective, that as well. And along with what you're saying, we are working on that now, and we plan to come out with some new material, if you will, and new educational efforts along those lines.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mrs. Craven, I will turn it over to you.
Well, let me say something that I wasn't planning to say, but I do think that the revised landscaping ordinance allows people to pretty much put in a not just native plant landscaping, but a xeriscape. Sometimes people have to take the initiative and ask. However, I think it's unfortunate that we made the decision to not have the newsletter just at this time, because the newsletter would have gotten to every single household and we could have had something in there about our regulations, how to change, what to do, where to go to get financial help, and how to do it. Some people don't understand who have been turned down by waterwise.com. They already took everything out. You got to have before pictures and a drawing or a something of what you plan to put in. So Be Waterwise has their rules too, and I think that the number of people we're sending things out to electronically don't anywhere match the number of households in the city. So we need to find some way to get that information out. I agree with you. I attended the investment committee meeting yesterday, and today I attended the California Contract Cities Association Legislative Committee, and I have a few things that I want to tell you about. We may have already sent letters on this, but in my opinion, sometimes, especially at the end, it's good if a second letter is sent. And these bills can all be lumped into one category, as far as I'm concerned, called Bills Against Local Control. Sacramento loves to jump in and say, oh my word, this happened in my district, it happened in Downey, this happened in my district, it happened in Pico Rivera, this happened in my district, it happened near Sacramento. So we're going to make sure that it never happens again statewide. And we're going to pass a bill that doesn't allow any city to do any of this stuff. And in essence, what they would like to end up doing is ruling every city in every way from Sacramento. So here is the first bill, AB 2011 by Wicks. It's called the Affordable Housing and High Road Jobs Act of 2022. Essentially, what it does is give any builder a right to go in and build affordable housing in any shopping center or business center that is vacant. And a lot of cities have shopping centers that are vacant or partially vacant. The cities have it zoned, general planned in one way. This would bypass the city planning. It would bypass your general plan, it would bypass everything. Contract Cities is very concerned about that. Another one is AB 2097, residential, commercial, and other development types parking requirements. It would prohibit cities from putting parking requirements onto commercial, residential, and business developments of certain kinds. That gets into our general plan, that gets into local control. Third one is AB 2234, REVUS. It sets a time limit for comments back to developers. We may not always be able to get back in 30 days or something. If you don't fit the requirement, then your ability to tell them what the city's requirements are has expired. I think some of these bills are just bonkers, frankly. The next one is SB 379 by my favorite, Mr. Wiener from San Francisco. Residential solar energy systems permitting. He wants energy on solar panels on everything, and just with like you have to issue the permit, no questions asked. And the concern that most of the cities represented on this committee have is that there are older homes, especially, that are not strong enough for the solar panels. It isn't just for homes, you can put them a lot of places. And if the building would fail because of the weight on the roof, then the liability would be on the city. All of this gets into local control. And the last one is SB 972, Gonzales, California Retail Food Code. It would take away a city's ability to regulate food vendors. And if you remember, we at one time had some problems with some food trucks parking on streets, people getting out there and stopping traffic. And we, after that strengthened, I think they were in the process of strengthening it anyway, but we strengthened our food vendor ordinance, and this would take away that ability. All of this gets into local control. Of course, the people in Sacramento know more about how to rule Camarillo and every other city than the local elected officials, at least in their minds. And so some of these are all bills that are still going. We opposed a lot of bills that have died along the way, but I think we need to jump in and let people know again that we really oppose these bills. I believe we've taken a stand according to our legislative platform on all of them. So the final thing is the history lesson. And I've gotten a bunch of calls, and I assume everybody else got the same calls, about Camarillo Heritage Days and Camarillo Fiesta, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about Camarillo Fiesta. A fiesta is a celebration, and the first Camarillo Fiestas were celebrations at the Camarillo Ranch. Adolfo Camarillo held many huge fiestas, some with as many as 450 to 750 neighbors and dignitaries, celebrating spring roundups, homecomings, and even the opening of the road between Camarillo and Thousand Oaks, for which Mr. Camarillo donated the land. They were on his front lawn, around and inside the circular driveway. His later fiestas were at the end of October to celebrate his birthday. He died in 1958. The city was incorporated in 1964, and the following year, the city council appointed council members Tweety Rouse and Stan Daly, along with planning commissioner Helen Ahern, to plan a celebration of the city's first birthday. Tweety, who had previously been married to Adolfo's son, the late Frank Camarillo, asked them to honor Camarillo's roots, so they decided to hold a traditional Mexican fiesta, complete with mariachi music, dancing, and a jamaica, or a Mexican-style carnival with food and booths arranged in a circle. That fiesta was held at the end of October to celebrate both Don Adolfo's birthday on the 28th and the city's incorporation on the 22nd. It was held at the Camarillo Ranch House with jamaica booths around the circular driveway. About 3,000 people, 1/3 of the city's population, attended. Other events included the Optimist Club breakfast, a small children's parade down Ventura Boulevard ending at Disdar Park, blessing of the animals ceremony on the steps of St. Mary Magdalene Chapel, a city birthday cake cutting ceremony, a reception where the Dones and Donias were named, and an art contest sponsored by the Camarillo Art Club. The winning entry was to hang in City Hall for 1 year. When Tweety Rouse left the council in 1970, Club Civico took over organizing the annual fiesta under the direction of Ed Genhardt. Attendance grew, so they moved the event to the Camarillo Community Center, making use of the outdoor stage at the back of the facility on the circular sidewalk, which jamaica booths ringed. 19 years later, attendance had dwindled, and Mr. Genhardt and Club Civico announced that they were ready to give up the job. An open community meeting was held on St. Patrick's Day, 1981, to determine interest. Nearly 50 people attended, most representing organizations that made money from the jamaica booths. At that meeting, it was decided to form the Camarillo Fiesta Association, with elected officers of John Herman, president, Betty Rutherford, vice president, Joe Wiebelhaus, treasurer, and Charlotte Craven, secretary and publicity director. Other board members represented the Y Indian Guides, Boy Scouts, Knights of Columbus, Club Civico, American Legion Auxiliary, Boys and Girls Club, Lions Club, and the Moose Lodge. It was also decided to hold fiesta on the weekend closest to October 22nd each year to celebrate both Don Adolfo's and the city's birthdays. New events were added and old events were changed to create interest. Publicity was extensive. That year's fiesta kicked off with the Pleasant Valley Historical Society naming the Dones and Donias on Friday evening, followed by a revived Miss Camarillo pageant. On Saturday morning, the Optimists held their Mexican breakfast, serving huevos rancheros, chorizo, and hot chocolate. It was followed by a parade with more than 50 entries, starting at the corner of Daly and Arneal, going up to Ponderosa where it turned west. About 3,000 people lined the streets, with many joining in to follow the final entry up to the community center, creating a nice crowd for the opening of the jamaica. At noon, blessing of the animals began, followed by Mayor Ron McConville cutting the city's birthday cake with the assistance of the new Miss Camarillo. Entertainment on the outdoor stage continued all afternoon. Later, a dinner dance was held with Les Brown and his band of renown playing big band music. On Sunday morning, the Y Indian Guides served a pancake breakfast in the community center, and the jamaica continued through the afternoon. With more than 8,000 people attending over the weekend, it was declared a success. In 1984, it was expanded to a week-long celebration for the city's 20th birthday, opening at noon on Sunday with Mayor Bill Esty ringing the St. Mary Magdalene Chapel bell, followed by Monsignor Hughes blessing the animals on the steps. That afternoon, the art club held an art exhibit with a Tiny Tots pageant held later in the day, followed by a concert at Constitution Park. On Thursday, the city hosted an open house in City Hall with another concert that evening. Friday afternoon, the Historical Society named the Dones and Donias at the mayor's reception held in the courtyard at City Hall, and that night, the Miss Camarillo pageant was held. Saturday got off to a fast start with a 5K walk and 10K run, followed by the Optimist breakfast and the parade. At noon, Mayor Esty and Miss Camarillo cut the city's birthday cake, opening the Jamaica with continuous entertainment all afternoon. New events were a petting zoo, a kiddie carnival, bingo in the senior center, and an exotic animal show from Moore Park College's Animal Trainers program. That night, Les Brown and his band of renown were back for a big band dance. The week-long celebration continued until 1991, when Councilmember Mike Morgan and his wife Donna took charge and cut it back to 2 days. Attendance had waned, so they moved Fiesta to the first weekend of October and moved it to Constitution Park. The parade began the same, but it ended at the new location. Public interest again zoomed. Miss Camarillo pageant was moved to February and the kiddie rides were dropped. Otherwise, events remained the same. The Jamaica was around the circular sidewalk in Constitution Park, and the number of booths jumped to more than 50, with entertainment on the pavilion. The following year, a chili cook-off was added, which drew many aficionados. By 1997, public interest again waned, and the Morgans had done about as much as they could with the Constitution Park location. So for 1 year only, they moved Fiesta to mid-July at Camarillo High School and brought in a large circus. But the location was not ideal for the event, so Fiesta was on the move again. In 1998, Councilmember Morgan asked the council to allow him to close down Ventura Boulevard for 2.5 days in July to put on the biggest party the town had ever seen. He was right. The production started on Friday night with carnival rides. More than 100 booths opened. The following day, a 10K race kicked it off with 2 full days of entertainment on 3 stages. Carnival rides, live radio broadcasts, a car show, a beer garden, and booths offering crafts, games, and food of all kinds lined Ventura Boulevard. Attendance was much larger than expected, so many of the food booths sold out well before dinner time, both Saturday and Sunday. Fiesta was declared a huge success. The following year, the city began a several-year redevelopment project on the boulevard, tearing out and replacing the street, curbs, and sidewalks. Didn't matter. Crowds continued to grow, and a total of 22 fiestas were held there under the Morgans' leadership, even though controversy and scandals arose when Fiesta Association treasurers embezzled funds 3 times. In 2020, the nation and county declared a state of emergency due to the COVID virus. The nature of many businesses changed, and the council decided to not allow the fiesta that year because of the health restrictions in effect, the fact that the boulevard restaurants had moved seating areas onto the sidewalks where booths would have been, and responding to complaints that the city was spending a large amount of money to support an organization that continually had embezzlements. That held for the following year as well. All of which brings us to this year, 2022, when the most recent celebration was not called a fiesta at all, but Old Town Heritage Days. It was held on Ventura Boulevard by the Camarillo Old Town Association under the leadership of Christine Chastain and Jeff Walker. Designed to draw business and attention to Old Town, Old Town Heritage Days began on Thursday and Friday nights with carnival rides, live art and food trucks, with a beer and wine garden added on Friday. Saturday and Sunday it went into full swing all day with those plus vendor booths, a car show, the Saturday Farmers Market, and live music. The Old Towns Association considered it a success. So now you have it. It grew from a very small, very local event to what it's been in the last few years. And that's all I have, Your Honor.
That was great. I think most of us know what Fiesta had been in our time. I was unaware of its whole kind of historical trajectory and where it kind of grew from.
And I have to tell you that I, doing publicity for this and for the Christmas parade for 8 years, I had gone through, in order to get the history, I sat down several days at the library with microfiche and went through all of the issues of the Camarillo News, which was easy, it was weekly, and then the Camarillo Daily News to get all the history of all these events.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you're doing that for us.
Well, I didn't do that now, I did it back
Back in the day. Okay.
back in the day when I was doing publicity for them.
All right, well, that gets us to the end of our 7 o'clock and the end of our agenda. Does anyone else have anything to add? Otherwise, we will adjourn our meeting, and we will, we'll come back in late August. We're dark in the first, or the second Wednesday of August. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. We're going to adjourn, as Mr. Kildee had requested, in the memory of Terry DeWolf.